Ruprecht Wittelsbach, the last Crown Prince of Bavaria, was born in 1869 in Munich, the grandson of the king. He would spend his life participating in some of the most interesting history of the age. His family ruled Bavaria, and when he was barely old enough to speak, his grandfather's kingdom was absorbed into the new German Empire. Ruprecht grew up in this new German nation, this novel experiment that had created a single superpower from 100 different states. In 1914, as a result of the assassination of an Austrian archduke, this empire hurled itself into the deadliest war in human history up until that point. Ruprecht commanded the German Sixth Army at the start of the war, but soon rose to the rank of Field Marshal as a result of his military skill, and commanded a whole army group. In the last year of the First World War, Ruprecht recognized that Germany would probably be defeated, and he resigned his position in November of 1918 as the war drew to a close. In the interwar years, he advocated the return of the German and Bavarian monarchies, as both his father the king and Germany's emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm, had been driven from power. He married Antonia of Luxembourg and started a family, whilst also taking time to warn German and British politicians about the rise of fascism in Germany, which concerned him greatly. His warnings went unheeded. In the 1930s, a group of fanatics led by an eccentric Austrian man with a Charlie Chaplin-style moustache took power in his country and plunged it into a second war. Ruprecht escaped Germany and spent the war in exile in Italy, advocating for peace and against the man who started the conflict. Although he remained safe, his family were captured in Hungary and sent to a number of concentration camps. Although they survived the war, his wife Antonia was affected so deeply that she died within a decade of liberation, and was buried in Switzerland after making a dramatic promise to never return to Germany after what she'd seen at Dachau. Ruprecht continued to advocate for the return of the monarchy, but wasn't taken particularly seriously. He spent his last years as a walking anachronism, a 19th century aristocrat condemned to live in a world that no longer resembled the one that he was born into. He died in 1955. In his 86 years of life, he had seen the two largest wars in human history and lived through 5 different states. The Kingdom of Bavaria gave way to the German Empire, which fell only to be replaced by the Weimar Republic. That republic was hijacked and remolded into the Third Reich, which after a 6-year death struggle gave way to the new Federal Republic of West Germany. Crown Prince Ruprecht lived through and participated in nearly a century of epoch-defining history, without having much of a say in how it went. For most people, history is something that just happens to them. Controlling history is impossible. Believe me, plenty of people have tried, and even the most influential, powerful, and brilliant amongst them are limited to having only small impacts on the way that things eventually turn out. And their level of control over that impact is often questionable. Many people set out to change history, and do, but they very rarely do it in the way that they intended. Most of us are sideline spectators to history, watching from the cheap seats and hoping that we don't get splashed. Others, like Crown Prince Ruprecht over here, get front row seats to some of the most dramatic chapters. Today's video is about someone who watched history from the VIP box. She had a premium view over the decay that led to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Empress Galla Placidia. Here she is. Galla Placidia was a part of what we now know as the last generation of the Western Roman Empire. She was at the centre of a series of events that would contribute piece by piece to the end of one of Western Europe's most defining eras. By the time of her death in the year 450, the empire that she had played a major role in all of her life was falling to pieces, and would survive her by less than 30 years. But you wouldn't guess that from the circumstances of her birth. Galla Placidia was born around the year 390-ish, the daughter of one of Rome's emperors, Theodosius I, and his new wife, Galla. She was doubly noble. Her father had been the emperor of the eastern half of the Roman Empire for about 10 years at this point, and her maternal uncle, her mother's brother, was Valentinian II, the emperor of the West. Placidia was not an only child. She had 2 older siblings from her father's previous marriage, half-brothers, one 13-year-old called Arcadius, and a 6-year-old called Honorius, and her relationship with them didn't start well. At the time of her birth, Placidia's father, Theodosius, was off fighting a war, which he was wont to do fairly often. So her mother, Galla, thought it would be a good idea to keep herself and her newborn safe at the imperial city of Constantinople, at the time being presided over by her stepson, Arcadius. This made sense on a lot of levels. The Roman world was a dangerous place for a newborn princess and the wife of an empress, and the imperial city would be the safest place for them, where Placidia would also get to meet her family for the first time. But Arcadius, the snotty little brat, refused to allow entry into the palace for his stepmother or sister. And he was totally allowed to do this because despite the fact that he was barely even a teenager, his father had already granted him the title and authority of Augustus, or co-emperor. This was fairly common practice in the late Roman Empire. Emperors would raise their still infant children to the rank of co-emperor to ensure that there was no confusion regarding the line of succession. The downside of this was when that emperor turned out to be a willful, petty, spoilt little bastard, which by all accounts Arcadius was, this might lead to them doing something as stupid and untactful as denying their own family entrance to the palace. And because this 13-year-old was technically emperor, everyone just had to do what he said. Our sources don't say why he did this or what anyone's reaction was, only that this was a rocky start for the siblings. Seeing as Airbnb wouldn't be established in the city for another 1,617 years, Placidia's mother had to set up her own household, far away from the palace. Luckily, Dad came to the rescue. Theodosius I finished up his war in the year 392 and made his way back to Constantinople to meet his new daughter and take control of things back from his useless oldest son. We don't know how the emperor reacted to the news that Arcadius had barred his wife and daughter from the palace, but it clearly set off some alarm bells, because the emperor was sure to equip his toddler daughter with her own households and estates to run. Now, the 2 to 4-year-old Placidia obviously wasn't expected to run these herself at this point. This wasn't an attempt to make his children actually share power. He was setting her up with an independent income and power base that her brothers couldn't mess with. Shortly after this, Theodosius bestowed upon his daughter the title of Nobilissima Puella, or Most Noble Little Girl. This was more than just a compliment, it was a proper title, the first step towards becoming an Augusta or an Empress. Along with this, he also raised his second son, Honorius, to the rank of Augustus of the West. Little Galla Placidia would have been too young to understand the political significance of this move. In the West, her uncle, Valentinian II, the emperor, had been found dead, hanged by a noose. Seemingly, he had taken his own life, or, as some speculated, he had been murdered. Either way, the legions of the West declared a new emperor, a man called Eugenius. Placidia's father opposed this, and raised his 9-year-old son to the rank of emperor as an alternative. This, and Placidia's own title, reflects Theodosius's dynastic policy. His family was special. His family was in charge. Only his family get imperial titles. So Placidia's father marched west, defeated Eugenius at the Battle of the River Frigidus, and reunited Rome under his rule. Theodosius I ruled over a large, prosperous, and re-stabilized Roman Empire. From the year 394 onwards, his rule, and that of his children, could not be challenged. The borders were secure, the usurpers were defeated. He had restored Rome to its ancient glory, just in time to die. In 394 and 395 respectively, little Galla Placidia, who was between 5 and 7 years old, lost both her mother and her father. Her mother, Galla, probably died in childbirth, which is a depressingly common fate for many Roman women. Her father's death was a little more shocking. The Emperor Theodosius was only 48 years old and appeared to be in good health, but in the early weeks of January 395, he was stricken by a sudden and severe illness that was likely either heart or kidney failure. Within days, the emperor was dead, and Galla Placidia was an orphan. All of Theodosius's heirs were still children, so the care of Placidia and the empire went to a man named Stilicho, who had been the emperor's right-hand man. He was a capable general and a skilled diplomat, who Theodosius hoped would guide his children towards becoming wise and beneficent rulers just as he was. So Placidia grew up in the care of her older cousin and Stilicho's wife, a woman called Serena, who would have ensured that Placidia, like all noble Roman girls, received a classical education in Greek and Latin, but also, at this point, a thoroughly Christian education. The lives of the saints, the teaching of the apostles, and the key aspects of the theology that her father had been so instrumental in cementing into Roman tradition. This peaceful life of learning, with all the luxuries of being a princess, was rudely interrupted when Placidia was about 18 years old. She was residing in the city of Rome when all of a sudden thousands of Gothic warriors surrounded the city and lay siege to it with her inside. But wait, who are the Goths and why are they laying siege to the ancient city of Rome? How did they get here and why isn't anyone doing anything about it? What is even going on in the Roman Empire? Galla Placidia lived in the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, an interesting time to be living in the Roman Empire. That empire, which apparently most men are regularly thinking about, looks a little different to how many of you viewers might be used to picturing it. The Roman Republic collapsed nearly 500 years before Placidia's lifetime. That most heavily televised portion of Rome's history is now long gone. It's been 330 years since Nero watched Rome burn, and a little over 200 years since Marcus Aurelius jotted down his meditations. The Rome of this era, the bit that we call late antiquity, is very different to the Rome that most people are familiar with. But it's also kind of the same. These are still Romans we're dealing with. They still do Roman things. They've still got a senate and consuls, although they're not as important anymore. They still have as much slavery as they ever did, and they're still ruled over by a Latin-speaking aristocratic elite. They're the same Romans, they're just different. What I'm getting at is that quite a bit of time has passed since the most famous Roman stuff happened. The Romans are different now, but they're still Romans. They're still similar enough as to not be a completely different people. So let's go over some of the ways that Rome of late antiquity was different to the Rome that most of us think of when we talk about the Roman Empire. Let's do some world building. The first and most obvious difference is a religious one. The Roman pantheon of gods, Juno, Mars, Jupiter and Apollo, have largely been replaced by the god of the Christians. Christianity had existed in Rome since the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, which is when the guy who kicked the whole movement off, Jesus of Nazareth, was crucified. Since then, Christianity had spread and grown throughout the Roman world, at the best of times being regarded by Romans as a weird Jewish sect with cannibalistic undertones to it that was nevertheless basically harmless. At the worst of times, Christians were actively persecuted. That was until the reign of the Emperor Constantine. He was the first emperor to convert to Christianity, build churches and hold synods. From his reign outwards, Rome is effectively a Christian empire. But how exactly that would work turned out to be far from straightforward. There would be growing pains as the empire tried to make its new faith fit. To start with, what exactly was Christianity? How does this God, who was a new one to many people, wish to be worshipped? What was Jesus, and why does his death on the cross mean anything? What makes a good Christian distinct from a bad Christian? These were all questions that needed to be answered. The first controversy would set the stage for how these kinds of issues would be resolved in the future. A sect of Christians called the Arians began disagreeing with the mainstream view of many Christians of the time. Arian, in this context, by the way, has nothing to do with the Aryans. You know, that group of people that a certain 20th century dictator was really, really keen on. That's Arian with a Y. This is Arian with an I, named for Bishop Arius, who was the preacher who first started saying that Jesus was not God, in the same way that God was God. Okay, so I'm not about to try and explain Christian theology and the nature of the Trinity now, because that would take up the whole video and I would definitely get it wrong. So very, very, very simply, Arius' doctrine was that seeing as God the Father begot God the Son, then God the Son was subordinate to God the Father, and therefore not equal to God the Father. If you're not a very religious Christian or a student of theology, the exact specifics of this don't really matter. What matters to our story is how the Emperor Constantine chose to deal with it. He called a church council to be held at the city of Nicaea, inviting all of the most brilliant and influential Christian minds, writers and preachers from throughout the Roman Empire to come and have a good old-fashioned debate to decide once and for all whose Christianity was the right Christianity. The debate had some fun moments, like an almost certainly untrue story from the Middle Ages about St. Nicholas, you know, jolly old St. Nick, the one who delivers presents to children on Christmas, who apparently got so angry at one of the Arian preachers that he full-blown decked him in the middle of the council. Like, straight up just started beating this poor guy for thinking that Christ was subordinate to God the Father. Anyways, the council eventually decided that Arius was a heretic and that his views were not valid, and that the proper way to worship Christ was as part of the Trinity, along with his dad and this more mysterious figure called the Holy Spirit. This was solidified in the Nicene Creed, a declaration of faith that, even to this day, defines most mainstream Christian sects. But like most debates, it didn't actually resolve the issue. It simply declared a winner out of two irreconcilable viewpoints. The side that won declared the conversation over and continued on their way with a newfound sense of self-righteousness, whilst the side that lost disregarded the results of the debate and carried on believing what they believed anyway, just more angrily. Arianism continued to exist, but on the fringes of the empire. Quick note on terminology here, by the way. A lot of the time, if you're reading about late antiquity or this kind of time period, those that adhere to the results of the Council of Nicaea are referred to as Catholics or Orthodox. And this is technically correct. The side that won would eventually evolve into the Catholic and Orthodox Church down the line. But I'm going to carry on calling them Nicaeans because, as we'll see, the Christians of this era are different in a lot of ways to Christians today. Catholicism and Orthodoxy are still faiths that people practice, but a lot of the doctrine hadn't been worked out by the 5th century, and there have been a fair few schisms since. So I don't want to confuse the Christians of this era with modern Christian theology. Rome also had a few other things to work out, now that it was a Christian empire. Like, how would religious and secular authorities interact with each other? Who had authority over whom, and in what circumstances? Galla Placidia's own father had to deal with one of the issues arising from this in the year 388. He had crushed a popular rising in the city of Thessalonica, but he'd crushed it a bit too hard. A general massacre had occurred, thousands of citizens were killed, and the whole thing had turned into a bloody, embarrassing mess for Theodosius. And this was made only worse and more embarrassing when he turned up for church a few days later, and the local bishop, Ambrose, refused him entry. He said that the emperor had committed a sin and could not come into church until he had done penance. This was genuinely wild. A mere bishop having the cheek to deny an emperor entrance into his church would have been unthinkable only a few decades before. But St. Ambrose, one of the church's most fiery advocates, made it thinkable, and the Emperor Theodosius, an incredibly devout and pious man, conceded. He did penance, he obeyed the bishop. A mighty emperor was made to obey a bishop. This is just one of the ways in which church and state, clergy and imperial family, and religion and empire were still figuring out how they'd coexist with each other. These growing pains trickled all the way down society. Aestheticism kicked off in a big way in the 4th and 5th centuries. People of relatively wealthy backgrounds giving up everything that they owned and donating it to churches or to charity, and instead choosing to live a simple religious life. This makes quite a lot of sense. If you look at the life of Jesus, he was very much in with poor people and not so much in with the mega wealthy. This led to examples like Melania the Elder and Melania the Younger, her granddaughter, both of whom were extraordinarily rich. They came from mega wealth, 1%ers of the 1%ers. They had miles and miles and miles of estates all throughout the empire, literally thousands and thousands of slaves, and they gave it all up and chose to live lives of relative poverty and religious devotion. This was a pretty novel idea that was new to the Roman world. And while all of this was going on, a great deal of the empire was still pagan. Everyone didn't just convert overnight when Constantine did. To a lot of Romans, this cult of Christ was something that was happening far away to other people. Throughout the 300s, paganism was very much in the background of this newly Christianized empire. Halfway through the century, the Emperor Julian attempted a short-lived pagan revival, but it didn't really work out. Hell, one of the main primary sources that I used to make this video was a guy called Zosimus, who was a pagan. He worked in the 6th century imperial treasury, over 200 years after the emperors that he worked for had converted to Christianity. The very word pagan comes from the Latin meaning countryside or rural, suggesting that Christianity spread fast in the cities and urban areas, but took longer to disseminate into the more isolated, more rural pockets of the empire. It was only at the end of the 4th century, during the reign of Placidia's father, that Rome started to seriously shed its pagan character. He was the first emperor to start seriously legislating against pagans, shutting down their temples and turning their festivals into workdays. It was during his reign that the Olympic Games faded into historical obscurity. The altar of victory was removed from the Senate House, and the Serapeum of Alexandria was destroyed. Okay, so Rome is now Christian, but not fully Christian. Also, they're not totally sure how to do Christianity properly yet, and the conversation around that isn't exactly civil. What else makes late antiquity distinct from the rest of Roman history? Well, there's also the matter of the emperors themselves. They're a little different from the ones that feature in I Claudius. You know, the famous Roman emperors. Togas, laurel wreaths, meetings with the Senate, etc. Here's an example of one of the ways that they're different. This is from the Aura Pacis, the Altar of Peace, commissioned by Augustus, Rome's first emperor. One of the figures depicted here is the Emperor Augustus. Can you guess which? If you guessed this guy, you'd be correct. I know it's tricky because half his body is missing, but that is our mighty Emperor Augustus. Now let's try that again with this mosaic here. Which one of these handsome fellas do you reckon is in charge? Perhaps it's this fella in the middle here. You know, the one with the big showy offy crown and the literal halo around his head. Something is different about the emperors of late antiquity. They're far closer to probably most people's idea of an emperor. Imperious, self-important, surrounded by grandeur. When the first emperor of Rome, Augustus, invented the office, he called himself princeps, meaning first citizen, literally first amongst equals. This had to do with the fact that Rome had governed itself as a republic for the best part of 500 years, and they were opposed to the idea of kingship on principle. The Romans of the early empire were uncomfortable with the idea of being ruled by an autocrat. So Augustus had to be subtle in his dominance. Early emperors had to pretend like they weren't dictators, even long after it had become obvious to everyone that they were, and act like they were just an especially powerful senator. Early emperors that embraced the reality of their role as the guy who was in charge of everything and acted like it, like Caligula and Domitian, often found themselves being murdered as a result. Late antique emperors weren't like that. Princeps, the word that emphasized equal as much as it did first, was no longer the title that they used. They preferred dominus, lord, an acknowledgement of their absolute power. They also embraced the trappings of this power. The simple toga had been discarded in favour of purple robes and bejewelled sandals. They had borrowed the idea of diadems, or crowns, from the Persian court. Senators no longer approached the emperor like they used to. Instead, they prostrated themselves in a bizarre new ceremony called the adoration, in which a few lucky individuals might even get the opportunity to kiss the emperor's clothes. So the emperors were now a bit more, if you'll pardon the pun, august. The dying fiction of a continued republic had finally been so worn down by centuries of rule by autocrats that the Romans had just done away with it entirely. The emperor was in charge, and power stemmed from the closeness of someone's relationship to him, not from their rank within the Senate. That Senate, which had once been the source of all of the most powerful and influential people from within the empire, was now little more than a glorified town council for the city of Rome. Like, they've still got their powers and privileges and things like that, but it's not what it used to be. The most influential people in the empire are no longer exclusively senators. They're more likely to be military men or favourites of the emperor. And Rome itself, the actual city, had also declined in importance. Emperors just didn't go there as often anymore, and not just because most of them weren't actually from Rome. Although most of them weren't. Galla Placidia's family originated from Spain originally. To be honest, Roman emperors had ceased to be exclusively from Rome pretty early in the empire's history. Claudius was born in Gaul, Trajan and his successors hailed from Spanish nobility, Septimius Severus was from Libya, and many of the 3rd century emperors were Illyrian in origin. But they had all ruled from Rome. No matter their place of birth or country of origin, once they took control of the empire, they ruled it from the eternal city. But as the 4th century dawned, the importance of the city of Rome dwindled. The empire was more often run from Milan, Sirmium, Trier, Nicomedia, or the city of New Rome, which most people called Constantinople. This was for the same reason that there were now often multiple emperors ruling at once. In the 3rd century, the Romans had learned that in an age where news and people could only travel as fast as a horse, running an empire that's enormous and multi-ethnic from some city halfway down Italy simply wasn't practical. Not only was the empire so large that it often buckled under its own size and weight, it was also busier than ever. At the start of the 4th century, the Emperor Diocletian had dramatically increased the size of the imperial administration, probably to prevent anyone from accruing so much power that they might threaten him. He made the provinces smaller so that there were more governors controlling less area. He brought in more clerks, more legal officials, more tax collectors. He separated military and civilian postings. There was more of everything. The early Roman Empire had governed itself in a fairly loosey-goosey type manner. This late antique government was more hands-on, more complex, and more absolute. The Romans were governing their empire more completely than they ever had before. But this made life harder and more stressful for the one guy who was in charge, who no longer just had to deal with a small clique of aristocrats, but an enormous civil service. The imperfect solution to this was more emperors, 2 or more courts across the empire to divide the workload of governing this enormous expanse and protecting its many hundreds of miles of borders. And when there was a confident and capable emperor in charge, this worked fine. Even with multiple emperors, it was more or less always clear that one of them was the dominant partner. When Valentinian I came to power, he took command in the west of the empire and gave the east to his brother Valens, but Valentinian was clearly the senior partner. When Diocletian came up with his tetrarchy, he divided the empire into 4, so he had 3 colleagues, but none of those 3 ever questioned the fact that he was the number 1 guy. But as we shall see, when incompetent or rival emperors rule at the same time, it's a recipe for disaster. One of the key reasons that emperors in the 4th and 5th century were having a harder time governing their empire than those in the 1st and 2nd had to do with the enemies they were facing. Barbarians were at the gates, and they were more dangerous than ever. For example, for much of its history, Rome's main rival in the east was the Empire of the Parthians. In 53 BCE, these guys had smashed a Roman army led by Marcus Licinius Crassus and sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. This victory turned out to be the high point for the Parthians regarding their relationship with Rome, however. Although they were the most dangerous rival of the Romans, there was never any question which of the two empires was the more formidable. Sure, Parthia could defend itself against Roman invasions, but it would never conquer Rome. The most it could do to hurt the Romans was make incursions into the border kingdom of Armenia. By the 2nd century, the Parthian Empire was basically just a training ground for the Roman legions. Septimius Severus would pop across the Euphrates every now and again to sack some Parthian cities and win some easy but flashy victories, and the Emperor Trajan even briefly managed to conquer their Mesopotamian provinces. The Parthians were just too unstable, too weak and too divided to threaten Rome seriously. But that all changed in 224. The Parthians, who ruled as a minority of nobles, were overthrown by a member of the local Iranian elite, a fella called Ardashir, who created the new Sassanid Empire. Or, if you asked him, he restored the old Persian Empire. You remember these guys, right? They're the bad guys from Greek history. This new empire was larger, more stable, and deadlier than the Parthian Empire had ever been. Gone were the days of Roman emperors trotting down to Ctesiphon with their legions for some sacking and some good imperial PR. Two emperors had tried and failed to treat the Sassanids the way that they used to get away with treating the Parthians. In the year 260, the Emperor Valerian had a pop at the Persians, and he got himself captured and was never released. The Roman emperor died in Persian captivity. Genuinely wild, that. Just over a century later, the Emperor Julian tried the same thing and got himself killed in battle. The Sassanids could not be walked over in the same way that the Parthians used to be able to. Not only could they defend themselves against the Romans, they could punch back. The Persian Shahs, not content with simply taking bites out of Armenia, had the military capability to assault deep into Roman territory. In the 540s, the Persian Shah would invade Syria and sack the ancient city of Antioch. And in the early 7th century, the Sassanid Empire would even briefly conquer the Levant and Egypt. The point is, back in the day, the Romans could rely on the fact that the Parthians, no matter how scary they were, weren't coming to get them. They no longer enjoyed that luxury. Any weakness shown by the empire was like blood in the water, luring the massive white shark of Persia towards its prey. Things weren't that much better on the northern frontier. Since the 3rd century, the Romans have been troubled by raiders from a group of people called the Goths, a confederation of Germanic tribes that lived in roughly this area. But then, in the 370s, loads of Goths entered the empire not as invaders, but as refugees seeking safety. It's a long story, but basically things turned violent, largely due to the corruption and mismanagement of the Roman officials dealing with this migration, and a war broke out. A war that led to a battle in 378 at Adrianople, in which the Goths wiped out a whole Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens. The ensuing war was where Galla Placidia's father had made his name by kind of defeating the Goths. The Romans won and eventually pacified the Balkans, but it wasn't a complete victory. The Goths got what they wanted. They were settled within the empire, but they didn't lose their identity. Their tribe wasn't broken up and dismantled and then fully integrated like so many before them had been. They kept their kings. Sure, those Gothic kings owed loyalty to the Roman emperor, but they still controlled their own people. As well as the Goths, there were also Franks, Alemanni, Suevi, Alans and Vandals, and many other tribal confederations on the empire's northern frontiers, looking to move west and south and settle within the empire's borders through either peaceful or violent means. We'll see more of these tribes and the reason they were so desperate to move later on. But for now, that's just a very brief overview of what makes this period in Roman history unique. The distinct elements of late antiquity that are different to the Roman Empire that we are probably more familiar with, the 1st and 2nd century. They are still very much Romans, though. Despite the shedding of the last vestiges of their republican facade, despite the conversion of many of them to Christianity, this is still very much the Roman Empire. They still command legions, they still speak Latin, they still adhere to classical Roman law, and they still consider themselves Roman. This is not a new empire, it is merely an evolved one. And with all of that world building out of the way, let's get back to our story. Last we left off, Galla Placidia was coming of age within the city of Rome, when it was dramatically put under siege by an army of Goths. To understand why our most noble girl is in such a situation, we have to rewind a little bit and talk about the drama happening behind the scenes during her childhood. When her father died in 395, he divided his united empire into two zones. The east would be ruled from Constantinople by his eldest and senior son, Arcadius, whilst the west would be ruled from Milan by his younger son, Honorius. Recognizing that all his children were still too young to rule alone, and perhaps also realizing that both his sons were useless, he appointed his trusted general Stilicho to be their guardian. Stilicho was in many ways a wise choice. He had proven in his dealings with the Persians that he was a capable diplomat, and his military career had been stunning. When the king of the Goths, a guy called Alaric, had kicked up a fuss about wanting a proper imperial title and lands for his people, Stilicho had decisively defeated him. He also brilliantly foiled another Gothic king by the name of Radagaisus. This chancer had seen the vulnerable position that Italy was in after the death of Theodosius and invaded. But a lightning-fast reaction by Stilicho led to the defeat of the Goths and the death of their king. Stilicho captured so many Gothic prisoners in this battle that he drove the price of a Gothic slave down to less than that of a cow. But despite his military and diplomatic success, Stilicho just couldn't get people to trust that he was working in the interests of the empire and not just his own. This wasn't helped by his attempts to ingratiate himself with the imperial family. He married his two daughters to the Western Emperor Honorius, one at a time, not at the same time, one daughter and then the other, and he betrothed his son Eucharius to Galla Placidia. This was a huge step to take. As I mentioned in the last chapter, power in this era came from proximity to the all-powerful emperor. And how does one get closer than by becoming family? In his dealings with the Eastern court, Stilicho only reinforced the suspicion in many people's minds that he was only in this for himself, his personal advancement and his personal power. He claimed that Theodosius had given him guardianship over the whole empire, not just the western provinces, but the court in Constantinople refused to recognize him. When his key rival in the city, a man called Rufinus, was murdered, many people asked the obvious question, who benefits? The answer was, Stilicho benefited, and the accusation of murder would follow him round wherever he went. This question of Stilicho's true loyalty was prompted by a few things. Firstly, he had defeated Alaric, the king of the Goths, multiple times, but the Goths had always been allowed to escape. Despite being beaten in battle, Alaric was always allowed to make his way to safety and live to fight another day. Why was Stilicho allowing this enemy of Rome to go free? This question was asked even more in the year 407. In late 406, the Rhine River, a giant natural obstacle, this barrier that protected the provinces of Rome and Gaul, froze over. Sensing opportunity, Vandals, Alans and Swabes, Germanic warbands, made their way across the frozen river and began rampaging through Roman territory. In Britain, this caused a fair bit of panic, so the locals raised a usurper emperor and killed him after he failed to fix everything. So they raised a usurper emperor and killed him after he failed to fix everything. So they raised a usurper emperor, and the third choice of the British legions was a man named Constantine, known to history as Constantine III. He thanked everyone for their support, and then hopped on a ship with all of his men and went across to the continent to defeat the invader and probably make himself like a proper emperor in Italy and all of that stuff. He took all of the legions in Britain with him, by the way, and they never came back. This is the end of Roman rule in Britain. Like, it was never official. No one made an announcement saying, "Attention, attention, people of Britain. You are no longer Roman. I repeat, you are no longer Roman." Put that toga down! It was a soft break. It's going to be a bit of a theme in this video. Bits of the empire just start crumbling off in a very undramatic way. The Romans were always coming and going. One day they went, and they just didn't come back. And the bewildered inhabitants of their empire just carried on with their lives, unaware of the fact that they had just lived through the collapse of that empire. Anyways, back in Italy, everyone was spitting mad over these Germanic invasions and the usurpation of Constantine. By the time news reached them, the rebels had already set themselves up in a rival court in Arles, and the provinces of Spain had joined their side. And to make things worse, the Emperor of the East, Placidia's half-brother Arcadius, had suddenly died at the age of 31. So we have Alaric and his Goths seemingly getting away with whatever they want to. We have barbarian invaders flooding into the provinces of Gaul. We have a usurper setting up a rival court in Arles, and we have a power vacuum in Constantinople after the death of Arcadius. What is Stilicho going to do about this? Stilicho's reaction to all of this news fed into the paranoia of his enemies. He sent Alaric, the king of the Goths, 4,000 pounds of gold, likely in exchange for Alaric's help in fighting the usurper Constantine. He then prepared to go to Constantinople and assume control of the entire empire as regent for Arcadius's young son, Theodosius II. Enter Olympius, a court eunuch who's been getting closer and closer to the young emperor Honorius. I forgot to mention in the last chapter, court eunuchs are a thing now. Old Rome didn't really have eunuchs, but New Rome does, so get used to that. Olympius whispered in the ear of the emperor, "Why doesn't Stilicho hand over power to you now that you're an adult? Why is he so keen to maintain complete control over you and your young nephew in the East? Who benefits from you being married to Stilicho's daughter? Not you, that's for sure. You're already an emperor. But he's inserted himself into the imperial family, perhaps because he's going to make a play for the top job." And then there's the matter of Stilicho's heritage. He wasn't particularly noble in his birth. His mother was a provincial Roman woman, and his father was a cavalry officer of Vandal descent. A good deal of the war bands now rampaging through Gaul are Vandal tribesmen. Could it be that Stilicho feels closer kinship with these Germanic invaders than he does to the empire that he is supposedly loyal to? I mean, why else would he defeat Alaric so many times and let him live? Why is he sending the Goths 4,000 pounds of gold to fight the Roman usurper? As one senator put it, paying the Goths off like this isn't peace, it's slavery. Honorius was turned against his guardian. Olympius orchestrated a riot in the city of Milan, where his men went out targeting any supporters of Stilicho or any soldiers loyal to him. His anti-Gothic rhetoric took things so far that it led to a general massacre of Germanic barbarians throughout Italy. Stilicho heard about all of this whilst he was in the coastal city of Ravenna, and recognizing that he was in danger, he sought sanctuary in a church. But Honorius's officials managed to lure him out with a letter from the emperor and a promise to the bishop that Stilicho would not be harmed. But as soon as the general was led outside the sacred bounds of the sanctuary, the soldiers produced a second letter, ordering Stilicho's execution. It's easy to understand why people were suspicious of Stilicho. The ancient authors can't make up their minds either, and they fluctuate between accusing him of being a corrupt political ladder climber and praising him as one of the last truly great Roman statesmen. But I think his final act proves that all of the accusations levelled against him were either false or exaggerated. Sure, he may have been power hungry, maybe even murderously so, but he always had his eye on the big picture. I don't think there's any doubt that he identified as Roman and with Rome, despite his Vandal heritage, and I think it's highly doubtful that he was putting the interests of barbarian invaders over that of the empire he served. But he recognised that that empire was weak, and he acted to strengthen it by any means necessary. When he saw enemies, he also saw them as potential assets that could be turned to his favour. This long-term thinking on the empire's behalf is likely why, when his execution order was read to him, he ordered his guards to stand down, and went willingly and peacefully to meet his fate. He could have started another civil war there and then for his own life, but he probably recognised that that would only further weaken the empire, and instead he chose to go quietly. The execution of Stilicho was an enormous mistake. Sure, he may have been power-hungry. Sure, he may have threatened the position of the emperor, but there was a reason that the dying Theodosius chose this man to run the empire on his children's behalf. He was the proper grown-up that they needed to keep them safe in the cutthroat world of imperial politics. Honorius wasn't a proper adult. Not really. I mean, he had the mind of a child, or at the very least the mind of a moron. Even in adult life, he never showed any signs of grasping the seriousness of his role as emperor, and was easily swayed by his sycophantic advisors. Stilicho had been an effective shield against the emperor's more idiotic tendencies. Now Stilicho was gone, and chaos reigned in Italy. The general massacre of those with Germanic heritage that followed the death of Stilicho was predicated on the idea that these were fifth columnists, enemies living within the empire, ready to turn on their Roman neighbours at the drop of a hat. By preemptively attacking these would-be traitors, Olympius and his followers made this so. Some 30,000 fighting men and their families made their way to the camp of Alaric and the Goths, seeking refuge. Honorius completed the removal of Stilicho's influence by divorcing his wife, who was Stilicho's daughter. He also had Stilicho's son, Eucharius, Placidia's one-time fiancé, killed. And this is where Galla Placidia, approaching her 20th birthday, re-enters our story. Sorry she's been absent for the first part of this video that is apparently meant to be about her, but to be fair, she was a child, more concerned with her education than with imperial politics. But here, at this point in the story, is when she takes her first steps into public life. She gives her consent for the murder of Stilicho's wife and her guardian, Serena. It's not a very glamorous entrance, helping to kill the woman who took her into her care after she was orphaned, but to be fair, we don't know the full extent of Placidia's involvement in this decision. Our chronicler simply says, Placidia thought it proper that she should suffer death. Was she the brains behind the execution, or did she just lend her support to it? She might not have even been in a position to refuse, we just don't know. To be fair, what little evidence we have from her childhood doesn't suggest a particularly easy relationship between Placidia and her guardians. For example, in all of the early imperial propaganda, which is mostly just sycophantic poems called panegyrics, Placidia is there. It's Stilicho the guardian, Serena his wife, Honorius the young emperor, and his sister Placidia, along with her betrothed, Eucharius, Stilicho's son. You know, one big happy family, that's how it's portrayed. But a few years later, the teenage Placidia is left conspicuously absent from depictions of the imperial family. Suddenly, it's as if the emperor doesn't even have a sister. It's very likely that she had either fallen out with her brother or her guardians, or perhaps both. So maybe she had Serena executed because she just didn't like her. That's fair, she was probably a harsh tutor, and how many teenagers, if given the opportunity to order an execution, wouldn't choose the person in charge of their education? But that wasn't the official reason. The official reason for Serena's execution was that she, like her husband, was in league with Alaric and the Goths. Now this is a ridiculous accusation, the absurdity of which is not lost on our ancient authors, but the Romans of the year 408 were particularly stressed about the king of the Goths, because that was the year that he laid siege to Rome. As you've probably inferred from the title of this chapter, the Goths are going to sack Rome, with Placidia still inside it. But the story of how they ended up doing this is such an absurd series of errors, made possible only by the incompetence of the Emperor Honorius and his advisors, that it's honestly worthy of a sitcom. I imagine Honorius as a David Brent type character, inexplicably in charge despite his total incompetence. You cringe at him more often than you laugh at him, and unlike in the American version of The Office, he's never endearing, and things don't end up working out for everyone in the end. I mean, look at this buffoon, the elongated face framed by scraggly sideburns. the gormless expression of a man who truly does not understand a thing about what's going on. Not even a hint of dignity in his horrific worm face. This all might sound a bit harsh, but trust me, by the end of this video, you will agree with my view that Honorius was worse for the Roman Empire than any other emperor in its long history. Despite the fact that he was besieging the city of Rome, Alaric, the king of the Goths, didn't want to loot, sack, and burn his way through the Roman Empire. Remember that his people had arrived as refugees, not as invaders. They didn't want to destroy Rome, they wanted to join it. And the Romans were fairly happy to have them, on one condition, that the Goths provide soldiers for the Roman army. Alaric and his nation became a vast recruiting ground of auxiliaries and mercenaries to fight in Rome's wars. The Roman army, from the foot soldiers all the way up to the officers, was filled with men of Gothic extraction. Until recently, that is. Honorius, on the suggestion of his eunuch Olympius, had endorsed all of that anti-barbarian violence across Italy, and this sent a good deal of his own army running to Alaric's. The Goths had many reasons to be unhappy with their side of the deal with Rome. The Emperor Theodosius had made use of them in many battles, and he always put the Goths in the vanguard, the very front lines. Alaric couldn't help but notice that his people bore the brunt of the casualties in these Roman wars, and shared very little of the reward. What Alaric wanted was security for himself and his people. They were poor, they were plagued with food shortages, and they were uncertain of their future. This is revealed in the demands he made of the Emperor Honorius whilst holding the city of Rome hostage. He wanted land for his people to settle on Rome's borders. He wanted an official military command for himself, and he wanted an annual shipment of grain and gold to be delivered to him. Honorius had two choices. He could either muster what army was left to him, fight Alaric and liberate Rome, or he could concede to Gothic demands, give them what they wanted, and welcome Alaric as a powerful new ally to wield against his other enemies. Honorius did neither of these things. He rejected Alaric's demands, and he made zero preparations to deal with the consequences. The Romans themselves, the people who lived in the city of Rome, put on a brave face and tried to intimidate Alaric. They sent out a delegation to inform the Goths that they had armed their population and they were ready to resist him. Alaric simply laughed and responded that the thicker the grass, the easier it is to cut. This left the Romans desperate. Many of them turned to their old gods, the new Christian one having given them little salvation. This was so prevalent and the feeling in the city so dire that even the Pope gave his permission for his congregation to do a little pagan sacrificing on the side, just in case that helped. But eventually, they gave in to Alaric's demands. They couldn't give him what he wanted, land for his people, an official position for himself, a reliable source of food, but they could give him treasure. All of the treasure in Rome. Households were plundered, public buildings were ransacked, and Rome's historic statues and artworks were destroyed, melted down to be given over to the Goths as ransom. Zosimus, a pagan chronicler, for whom these statues were of immense religious significance, recalls the melting down of the statue of Virtus. Virtus is the root of our English word virtue, but in its Roman context it means something closer to manliness, masculinity, fortitude, those kinds of things. Zosimus commented that when the Romans lost their statue of Virtus, they lost their own Virtus as well. Alaric also demanded that every Gothic slave in the city of Rome be handed over to him, which we can imagine was quite a few people. Remember a few years ago when the price of slaves had been driven to record lows because Stilicho won a battle against the Goths and captured so many of them that he just flooded the market. There's a contemporary chronicler from this time who wrote only a few years before the sack of Rome, saying that every household in the empire, even one that profits a little, has a Gothic slave. This event, by the way, isn't the sacking of Rome. That comes later. This is more like the mugging of Rome. Alaric simply showed up, demanded everything of value within the city, and the Romans just handed it over to him. Bit pathetic, really. One senator even tried to appeal to Alaric's merciful side, telling him that if he took so much, he would leave nothing for the citizens. Alaric responded coldly. He would leave them their souls. This mugging of Rome finally kicked Honorius into gear and forced him to make some kind of a decision. He decided to make deals with both of his enemies. He recognised Constantine III as legitimate and made him a co-emperor, and he reopened negotiations with Alaric. It may seem odd that Honorius flip-flopped between wanting to fight both of his enemies and wanting to make a deal with both of them. But that's because he had absolutely no intention of keeping his side of the bargain with Alaric. Whilst he was negotiating with the Goths, Honorius secretly transported 6,000 elite troops from Dalmatia to Italy. His plan was to take the Goths by surprise and wipe them out. And this plan failed. Alaric was smart. He turned the would-be ambushers into the ambushed. He cut the Roman army to pieces in the hills of Tuscany, leaving only 100 survivors to return to Honorius and report on the defeat. What Alaric did next shows that his long-term intention was still to integrate with the empire, not to destroy it. Despite this betrayal, he still wanted to negotiate with the emperor. He reiterated his demands. He wanted land, food, and official recognition, and when Honorius refused, he lessened those demands. He recognized that he couldn't fight Rome forever, but Honorius would not give in. Despairing, Alaric realized that this emperor was never going to deal with him. He needed a new one who would. So the Goths returned to the city of Rome, but this time with a different purpose other than to just hold it hostage again. Alaric chose a member of the Senate, a man called Priscus Attalus, and made him the new emperor of the West. For those of you keeping count, there are now 4 emperors in the Roman Empire: Theodosius II in the east, Honorius, Constantine III, and Priscus Attalus in the west. Priscus was supposed to be the emperor who would give the Goths what they wanted. He was pagan when they chose him, but he was baptized into the Arian brand of Christianity upon his ascension. You guys remember the Arians? They're that heretical sect of Christians from chapter 2. Well, the Goths are Arians, so having a fellow Arian as emperor was politically expedient for them. Unfortunately, his conversion was pretty much all that Priscus Attalus could offer Alaric and the Goths. He didn't really have any power outside of the city of Rome. Spain and Gaul were in the hands of Constantine III, now an ally of Honorius's. Italy was in turmoil, and North Africa did not accept Attalus's ascension. North Africa especially was a problem here. Remember that Alaric doesn't just command a Gothic army, he commands a Gothic people. Thousands upon thousands of them. There are the warriors, yeah, but there are also their wives, their children, the elderly, and those that can't fight. Those victims of Roman violence and the slaves that he'd liberated only swelled the number of people that he was responsible for. Since the days of the Roman Republic, the provinces of North Africa had been Italy's main source of grain. The Western Empire relied on this region to feed itself. Now both the city of Rome and the Goths were starving. Alaric wanted to sail to North Africa and restart the grain shipments by force. Priscus Attalus opposed this idea, though. Perhaps he didn't like the optics of using a Gothic army to fight Romans, or perhaps he feared for his own regime without Alaric's army right there in Rome to prop it up. Either way, the Goths got impatient. Food shortages forced them to act, and Alaric did this by deposing his recently crowned emperor. Priscus Attalus had his robes of office stripped from him and sent back to Honorius. In doing this, Alaric repented his support for the usurper and acknowledged Honorius as the true emperor of the West. Negotiations could reopen, except it turns out they couldn't. Peace talks were arranged, and Alaric did go north to meet with some of Honorius's ambassadors, but this hopeful start was brought crashing down by a man named Sarus. Sarus was one of Honorius's generals, and he was Gothic in origin, but this doesn't mean he had any loyalty towards Alaric or his army. Quite the opposite, in fact. Sarus hailed from a clan of Goths who were hereditary enemies of Alaric's family, and this blood feud ran deep. Without orders, on his own initiative, Sarus attacked Alaric. Now, this wasn't a decisive battle. Sarus only had a small number of men, not enough to wipe the Goths out, but he did manage to kill enough Goths to thoroughly piss off the by now extremely exasperated king. Alaric took this as a sign that Honorius had betrayed him again, and this time it really was the last straw. The seemingly infinite patience of the Gothic king with this incompetent emperor and his desire to integrate with and not destroy Rome had finally fizzled out. So when Alaric returned to the Eternal City, he sacked it. Properly this time. Well, sort of properly. I mean, as far as sackings go, the Gothic sack of Rome in 410 wasn't exactly apocalyptic. The Goths took goods and started fires, but they didn't massacre the population. Remember that the Goths are predominantly Christians. They're Arian Christians, so there's a few doctrinal differences between them and the people of Rome, but still very much Christians. Alaric gave orders that churches and anyone who took shelter within them were not to be touched. He told his people to loot whatever they wanted, but to refrain from bloodshed. But beyond all of the religious debate, we can catch glimpses of what the sack of Rome was really like. And it does seem that by the standards of ancient sackings, it was fairly mild. Alaric restrained his warriors, either because of his piety and unwillingness to risk offending God, or because deep down somewhere he still wished that he could make a deal with the empire and integrate into it. Probably a little bit of both. As a result, even though Rome was traumatized by this event, it did recover. The population didn't plummet. Most major buildings remained intact, and the people were, generally speaking, not treated with the same level of barbarity that usually accompanied an ancient sacking. That being said, Rome was still stripped of its wealth. Its people still suffered. Murders and assaults of all kind were rarer than to be expected, but definitely still happened. The mausoleums of the Emperor Augustus and Hadrian were ransacked and destroyed, and fires started by the Goths destroyed swathes of the city. Whilst many contemporary chroniclers emphasised the mildness of the sacking, there are some whose accounts stand in contrast to this. Like, for example, Pelagius, a British monk who lived through it. He says, "You yourself are witness to how Rome, that commanded the world, was astonished at the alarm of the Gothic trumpet. When that barbarous and victorious nation stormed her walls and made her way through the breach, where were then the privileges of birth and the distinctions of quality? Were not all ranks and degrees levelled at that time and promiscuously huddled together? Every house was then a scene of misery, and equally filled with grief and confusion. The slave and the man of quality were in the same circumstances, and everywhere the terror of death and slaughter was the same." After 3 days, the Goths left Rome, their wagons filled to the brim with loot, including the most valuable treasure of all, our very own Galla Placidia. Unlike a great many people who came from wealth and power, Placidia had opted to remain in the city of Rome throughout the siege. She had the opportunity to leave. Alaric's siege had been fairly on and off, depending how high his hopes were of striking a deal with Honorius. Plenty of people who had the means took the opportunity to, whenever the Goths weren't surrounding the city, make their way somewhere safer. We don't know why Placidia didn't do this. We don't really know anything about what she got up to whilst Alaric was sacking the city. All we know is that when Alaric left, he took Placidia with him. The Emperor's sister was bound to come in handy at some point, so Galla Placidia joined the Goths on their journey south. Okay, let's take stock of the last 15 years of Galla Placidia's life. In 395, her father, Theodosius, died and left the empire to her 2 incompetent brothers and her guardian, Stilicho. By the year 408, both Stilicho and one of her brothers are dead, and the western half of the empire is left in the hands of her idiotic brother, Honorius. The eastern and western courts aren't really on talking terms. Half of the Western Empire is in the hands of tenuously legitimized usurpers, and barbarian tribes run rampant throughout the provinces. Of these tribes, the ones who are best disposed towards the Romans and most likely to help them, the Goths, have turned against the emperor, and the historic city of Rome had been sacked for the first time in 8 centuries. Galla Placidia was now a prisoner of the people who had ransacked her home city. All in all, things look quite bleak, and not just for Galla Placidia and the Romans. Alaric and his Goths were also in a pretty tenuous position. Remember that the sack of Rome was not a triumphal moment for them. It was a desperate move, a last resort after years of trying to negotiate with the emperor. Now they'd sacked the Eternal City. What were they to do next? Alaric decided that if he couldn't negotiate a settlement with Rome, he would just have to go and take what he needed instead. Alaric set his sights on the province of Africa. This was Rome's breadbasket, where grain grew in abundance. He took his people on the move south in the hopes of purchasing a fleet and crossing the sea to his new home. However, as soon as he began loading his people onto boats and sending them away from shore, a storm struck. Most of his newly purchased vessels were damaged or sunk, and many of his people drowned. The season wasn't right for sailing, and he didn't have the supplies to wait until it was. The Goths would have to keep moving. But Alaric himself wouldn't live to see where they ended up. He had fallen dangerously ill in the months after his sacking of Rome. Malaria was the likely culprit. The swamps south of Rome were full of it, and Alaric had passed right through them. Aged around 40 years old, the king died. The death of their king had a profound impact on the Goths. This disparate group of tribes had been united by him, and he had led them for 15 tumultuous years. The 6th century Gothic writer Jordanes records that his people mourned him with great affection. His burial is noteworthy. Likely reckoning that without guards, his tomb would be ransacked, the Goths came up with a creative solution. They diverted a river by damming it. Then they dug a tomb in the river bed, in which they buried Alaric with a ton of wealth. Then they undammed the river, so his grave would remain forever hidden and inaccessible beneath the water. As an extra precaution, they put all of the slaves that had dug the grave to death, to ensure that nobody would ever know the burial place of their king. To take the place of their great leader, the Goths opted for Alaric's brother-in-law, Ataulf. Ataulf, sometimes spelt Atawulf, was the obvious choice. He had been Alaric's right-hand man, so he obviously knew how to lead. And he was a short king. Literally, Jordanes, our chronicler, gives a brief one-sentence description of Ataulf, and he feels the need to point out that the new Gothic king was short in stature. But Jordanes does say that he was a good-looking man regardless, which does feel like a bit of a backhanded compliment. You know, you're pretty attractive considering your height. For the next 2 years, both Ataulf and Placidia go quiet in our sources. All that we know is that Ataulf abandoned Alaric's plan to sail to Africa and instead turned north and crossed the Alps into southern Gaul. The next we hear from them is 2 years later, in 412 CE, when they're contacted by the Emperor Honorius appealing for aid. Which sounds a little odd, right? Honorius doesn't want to make a deal with the Goths, so they sacked Rome, and now he wants to make a deal with the Goths? Well, things in Italy had changed a little over the last 2 years. Okay, so the sack of Rome shook Honorius up a little bit, and made him change his approach slightly. To start with, he took Olympius, that eunuch whose bright idea it had been to kill Stilicho, and had him clubbed to death, which was honestly in everyone's best interests, except maybe Olympius's. With this bad influence out of the picture, Honorius found a new grown-up to clean up his mess and run his empire for him. A competent, no-nonsense soldier called Constantius. Not to be confused with Constantine III, who's that usurper emperor in Gaul. Well, actually, he's not a usurper, technically. He's been recognised by Honorius and made an official co-emperor. Except not anymore. By 412, he was technically a usurper again. What had happened is in 409, Constantine III had had the bright idea of raising his son to be co-emperor with him. The idea being that Constantine would stay in Arles and govern Gaul, whilst his son, Constans, would go to Spain and take control of the situation there. Honorius wasn't consulted on this and didn't like it one bit, so he denounced Constantine and sent his general Constantius to bring the north of the empire back into the imperial fold. So we have Constantius fighting Constantine and Constans. Really diverse naming traditions the Romans had. But before Constantius even arrived to fight them, Constans messed up. He really fumbled the defence of Spain. Before long, hordes of Germanic tribesmen, Swabes, Vandals and Alans, poured across the Pyrenees and started pillaging the territory. So Constance's general, a guy called Gerontius, rebelled and raised himself up as emperor along with another man called Maximus, who might have been his son. So for those of you keeping count, there are now 6 emperors in the Roman Empire. There's Theodosius II in Constantinople. He's doing just fine. We've got Honorius in Ravenna. We've got Constantine III and Constans in Gaul. And in Spain we have Gerontius and Maximus. Now, if all of this has confused you, don't worry, it's about to become irrelevant anyway. Constantius, Honorius's flash new general, arrived on the scene with his army, and Gerontius's own men, suddenly less keen to fight the civil war than they had been 5 minutes ago, turned on him. Gerontius, in a moment of mad desperation, climbed onto the roof of a local house and fired arrows at passers-by, daring anyone to climb up and fight him. His soldiers burnt the house down and he died. Maximus, his partner who might have also been his son, fled into historical obscurity, and the Spanish rebellion was over. Constantius then marched to Gaul and defeated Constantine III's army, besieging the usurper emperor in the city of Arles. Constantine III probably figured at this point that all was lost, and he rushed to a local church to have himself ordained as a priest. Seemingly he wanted to wiggle out of the whole "I usurp the throne" thing that he's been getting away with for several years at this point. This almost worked. Constantine managed to negotiate safe passage for himself and his son out of the city, but somebody, likely Constantius, recognised that letting ex-usurper emperors live wasn't particularly good policy, had him intercepted, and Constantine and Constans were both beheaded. And so ends the civil wars. But not yet. In North Africa, a man called Heraclian rebelled against imperial authority. At the same time, the Roman army at Mainz, with allies amongst the Burgundian and Alan tribesmen, raised a new usurper emperor called Jovinus. And it was at this point, in the year 412 CE, that Honorius sent a message to Ataulf, making him an offer. The Goths would be granted federate status, the very thing that Alaric had fought so long and so hard to achieve. This meant that Ataulf would have land for his people to settle. It meant that they would get a yearly dole of grain to prevent famines, the kind of which they've been dealing with for years now. And all he had to do to hold up his end of the bargain was fight on Honorius's behalf against this new usurper. And to return Galla Placidia. Honorius had no children, and as he got older it became increasingly clear that he probably never would. Any heir to the Theodosian dynasty in the west would probably end up being a child of Galla Placidia's, so the emperor wanted his sister back. However, according to the account of Olympiodorus of Thebes, this deal went sour. Ataulf fought and killed Jovinus, along with his brother, who was also involved, and he sent their heads to Honorius, presumably confident that the grain his people so desperately needed would arrive in no time. But there was a complication. That grain would have to come from North Africa, a region that had also broken out into rebellion. Now, Constantius had effectively ended this rebellion by having its leader murdered, but the situation in North Africa in 412 was still unstable enough that procuring a large shipment of grain was simply not realistic. So Ataulf wasn't getting the much-needed food that he'd asked for. Honorius sent him excuses that were probably reasonable, but also demanded that Placidia be returned to him immediately. And Ataulf said, "Sure, I'll give you your sister back as soon as the shipments of food start." And Honorius said, "No, you give her back now, then you get your grain. And so on, and negotiations broke down. Ataulf responded by attacking the city of Massalia, modern-day Marseille in the south of France. If the emperor wouldn't give him food, he would take a port town and damn well import it himself. But Ataulf was very almost killed when a Roman officer by the name of Bonifacius hurled a javelin into his shoulder from the city walls. The king very almost died, and he had to withdraw from Massalia. And Bonifacius, the officer who almost killed him, was hailed as a hero. Keep an eye on this Bonifacius character, he'll be important later. When he'd recovered, Ataulf attacked and took the port town of Narbo, which was less well defended. That's modern Narbonne. Finally, he could feed his people through imports through the port city and through the fertile fields of southern Gaul. And then, in the year 414, Ataulf and Placidia spat in the face of Honorius by marrying one another. Bet you didn't expect that twist, did you? Galla Placidia, the sister of the emperor, marries a barbarian king. I'm pretty sure that's a first for Roman history. This was not only an insult to Honorius and Constantius, it also solidified Ataulf's place as part of the imperial structure and the place of the Goths as part of the Roman Empire by marrying into its imperial family. A speech of Ataulf's survives to us through the writer Orosius, who apparently heard about it from a man who was there many years later, and it outlines the Gothic king's thinking here. He supposedly said, "For I myself, while at the town of Bethlehem in Palestine, heard a certain man of Narbo, who had served with distinction under Theodosius, and who also was a pious, sensible, and serious person, tell the most blessed priest Jerome that he himself had been a very intimate friend of Ataulf at Narbo, and that he had often heard what the latter, when in good spirits, health, and temper, was accustomed to answer in reply to questions. It seems that at first he ardently desired to blot out the Roman name, and to make all the Roman territory a Gothic empire in fact, as well as in name, so that, to use the popular expression, Gothia should take the place of Romania, and he, Ataulf, should become all that Caesar Augustus once had been. Having discovered from long experience that the Goths, because of their unbridled barbarism, were utterly incapable of obeying laws, and yet believing that the state ought not to be deprived of laws, without which a state is not properly a state, he chose to seek for himself at least the glory of restoring and increasing the renown of the Roman name by the power of the Goths, wishing to be looked upon by posterity as the restorer of the Roman Empire, since he could not be its transformer. On this account he strove to refrain from war and promote peace. He was helped especially by his wife, Placidia, who was a woman of the keenest intelligence and of exceptional piety. By her persuasion and advice, he was guided in all measures, leading to good government. This wedding represented what Placidia and Ataulf hoped would be the beginning of a new golden age, a Roman Empire restored to its past glory by Gothic arms, obeying Roman laws. The wedding itself, although both Gothic and Gallo-Roman nobility were in attendance, was thoroughly Roman. Galla Placidia adorned herself in all of the trappings of a Roman imperial bride, without a hint of Gothic attire. Ataulf too rejected his own traditional garbs in favour of a Roman general's outfit. The message was clear. Ataulf had married a Roman princess. He was now as much a member of the Roman aristocracy as any senator in Rome. I have fun imagining this wedding. Olympiodorus of Thebes gives us a nice little description of it, of the Gallo-Roman nobility and the Goths playing party games together and having a jolly old sing-along. Leading the chorus of the singing is a familiar face, none other than Priscus Attalus. You know, that guy who was emperor for like 15 minutes back during the siege of Rome. He probably understood that he wouldn't be welcome in the court of Honorius after he'd, tried to usurp the title of emperor. So he'd just been kind of hanging out with the Goths for the last 5 years. Now he was leading the chorus at Galla Placidia's wedding. What a wild world, hey? One thing that didn't seem to come up was the religious differences between the bride and groom. Galla Placidia, like the rest of her family, was a staunch Nicene Christian, whilst Ataulf, being from Gothic nobility, was part of the Arian Christian sect that many Romans considered to be heretical. But this doesn't seem to have caused any problems. probably because marriage was not yet a religious affair in the way that it is to so many Christians nowadays. God hadn't really entered the picture yet. Marriage was, to the late Romans, similar to what it had been to the early Romans, a social and legal contract, not a religious one. There was no sense of done in the eyes of God or till death do us part. Divorce was still fairly common and relatively uncontroversial. And so Galla Placidia became Queen of the Goths. This did nothing to calm her brother Honorius down. He ordered his general Constantius to blockade the port of Narbo and starve the Goths out. And this worked. Shortly after their wedding, Ataulf and Placidia were forced to yet again pack up everything they owned and lead their people to pastures new, this time over the Pyrenees and into Spain. On the way, Ataulf made Priscus Attalus emperor again in an act of impotent rebellion. Nobody took this particularly seriously, and at some point on the way to Spain, the Goths just abandoned him at the side of the road. Priscus had to make his own miserable way back to Italy, where he was quickly picked up by Honorius's agents and forced to walk around in a parade of public humiliation, which involved him getting 2 of his fingers cut off and then being sent into exile. Which is a bit odd. You know, ex-emperors don't usually get off so lightly. I mean, I know it's unpleasant having 2 fingers cut off and being exiled, but usually they're killed. I mean, in Byzantine history, they're more often blinded, but even that, I'd argue, is worse than having 2 of your fingers cut off. Either way, I'm happy for Priscus Attalus, I really am. I'm glad he managed to survive the turbulent life of imperial politics and come out the other end to live in a reasonably, or at least I hope reasonably, happy retirement, be it with only 8 fingers. About a year after her wedding, Placidia gave birth to her first child, a baby boy. As if any further proof was needed that Ataulf, despite the numerous rejections of Honorius, was still looking to integrate himself with the Roman imperial system, they named the boy Theodosius after his maternal grandfather. This was a Gothic prince, yes, but the point was made that he was also a legitimate member of the Theodosian imperial family, and a potential heir to Honorius. But not for long, sadly. It's a depressing fact about the ancient world that infant mortality was astronomical by today's standards. Between 1/3 and 1/5 of children born never made it out of infancy. Sadly, for Ataulf and Placidia, little Theodosius was a part of this grim statistic. He died shortly before his first birthday. The couple buried him in a coffin of solid silver just outside the city of Barcelona, and it wouldn't be the last tragedy of that year. One of Ataulf's attendants, a man called Dubius, which is a fairly dubious name if you ask me, a man called Dubius held a grudge against the Gothic king. Apparently at some point in the last few years, Ataulf had killed this man's previous master. The incident in question had probably happened about 2 years previously, when Ataulf was fighting against the usurper Jovinus. Do you guys remember Sarus from the previous chapter? He was the Gothic general who was in the employment of Rome, and his clan was part of a blood feud with Alaric's family. He was the one who ambushed Alaric and the Goths when they were trying to negotiate with Honorius, just before the sack of Rome. Well, at some point during the Civil War of 413, Ataulf had bumped into Sarus a little north of the Alps, and seeing an opportunity to settle an old score, Ataulf and his warriors fell on Sarus and killed all of them. Ataulf marched away with Sarus's head, probably confident that he had put an end to this blood feud. But he hadn't. That's the thing about blood feuds. As long as one member of one side still survives, the feud is still ongoing. This new attendant of his, Dubius, had likely at one point been loyal to Sarus, and had been biding his time, looking for an opportunity to avenge his old master. And one day, whilst Ataulf was alone, tending his horse, Dubius whipped out a dagger and stabbed the king. Ataulf's death put an end to Placidia's reign as Queen of the Goths, and it also plunged her into a world of danger, especially considering her husband's replacement. The next king of the Goths was a man called Singaric, who apparently secured this position using murder, violence, and intimidation. But worst of all, he was the brother of Sarus, and therefore a blood enemy of Alaric and Ataulf. Cingeric's first action as king did not bode well for Placidia. He killed all of Ataulf's children, all young daughters from a previous marriage before Ataulf had married Placidia. If her young son had survived infancy, it's likely he too would have been murdered in this purge. Placidia wasn't killed along with the rest of the family, but instead Cingeric forced her to take part in a grisly display of public humiliation, walking her in front of his horse for 12 miles as if she were a prisoner. But luckily, Placidia's fortunes changed yet again. 7 days after seizing the throne, Cingeric was himself murdered, and replaced by a man called Walia. And Walia was far less hostile to Placidia or the memory of Ataulf. But that doesn't mean he had any desire to keep her around. Like Ataulf, Walia wanted to cultivate a good relationship with Rome and the Emperor. Unlike Ataulf, he didn't want to do this by marrying Placidia, he wanted to do it by exchanging her. So he sent her back to Honorius in exchange for enough grain to make 12 million pounds of bread, which was enough to excite all of the Goths and probably all of the Ducks in Europe. And so, after 6 years with the Goths and 2 years as their queen, Placidia returned to Italy and dived right into the heart of the deadly game of imperial politics. The specific part of Italy that Galla Placidia returned to was Ravenna, a city here on the northeast coast. I haven't talked about Ravenna yet, or why the emperor was holding court in this particular city. We know that unlike Galla Placidia, he wasn't in Rome when it was sacked, and at the time of Stilicho, emperors were ruling from the city of Milan. So why Ravenna? As I mentioned in chapter 2 of this video, Rome hadn't been the central city of the empire for a good few generations at this point. The needs and demands of late antique emperors were no longer met by the Eternal City, and since the 3rd century, Milan had become the more convenient Italian capital. Like, don't get me wrong, Rome is still important. It still has plenty of privileges and benefits as a city, and it's the symbolic heart of Roman civilization, but it's no longer the seat of power. Honorius had moved to Ravenna after the death of Stilicho, and he'd taken his whole court with him. For the rest of Roman history, this city would be the centre of power in the west of the empire. The Roman geographer Strabo, writing about 450 years before this time period, describes the city like this. Situated in the marshes is the great Ravenna, built entirely on piles and traversed by canals, which you cross by bridges or ferry boats. At the full tides it is washed by a considerable quantity of seawater, as well as by the river, and thus the sewage is carried off, and the air purified. In fact, the district is considered so salubrious that the governors have selected it as a spot to bring up and exercise the gladiators in. It is a remarkable peculiarity of this place that, though situated in the midst of a marsh, the air is perfectly innocuous. The same is the case with respect to Alexandria in Egypt, where the malignity of the lake during the summer is entirely removed by the rising of the river, which covers over the mud. Another remarkable peculiarity is that of its vines, which, though growing in the marshes, make very quickly and yield a large amount of fruit, but perish in 4 or 5 years. I imagine it as being a bit like Venice, traversed by canals through the rivers and marshes of the city. For most of Roman history, Ravenna had been a mere naval base, so why was it now the central seat of power? The reason lies in those marshes that Ravenna is in the middle of. It is a hard city to get into, and it is an easy city to defend. With Alaric rampaging round Italy with his Goths and laying siege to cities like Rome, Honorius felt Ravenna was the safest place for him. And he was probably right, but this shows the attitude that he took towards ruling. His father and emperors before him had ruled from Milan because it was just a hop, skip and a jump to the northern provinces. Milan was a good jumping-off point if you had to quickly leave Italy and be somewhere else in the empire. Theodosius I had been this kind of emperor. He was almost never home, constantly away fighting some war or managing some crisis in the provinces of his empire. Honorius's move to Ravenna betrays his insecurity. Unlike his father, he didn't ride out to face challenges head-on and protect Italy. Instead, he accepted that he could no longer keep the home province safe, and sought to guarantee his own security at the cost of his empires. Although nobody at the time knew it, the emperors of the West would never again feel secure enough to leave the safety of Ravenna and try and re-establish themselves in another city. This new capital is a depressing reminder of the fact that we are dealing with an empire that is on the back foot and that will never regain its balance. And this was the city that Galla Placidia returned to in 416. She was widowed and twice bereaved, but she didn't return powerless. She had plenty of money from the estates that her father had granted her when she was a child, and she returned with a large bodyguard of Gothic warriors who had come with her from Spain. These guys were loyal to her and her alone. When Placidia returned, she was met with the unwelcome news that she was engaged to be married. Honorius planned to wed her to his general and caretaker, Constantius. Constantius was the reason that things were going better for the Roman administration in 416 than they had been back in 410. He was the guy really running the show around here, whilst Honorius broke his toys and threw tantrums and refused to eat his vegetables. I imagine. I've got no source for the fact that Honorius behaved that way, but it's very much his vibe. Just to remind you how much of a dolt Placidia's brother the Emperor was, here's a fun little anecdote for you. When the Goths sacked Rome in 410, news reached Ravenna of the city's fall. "Dominus, Dominus," said the eunuch bearing the bad news. "Rome has perished." And Honorius wailed, "Oh, oh, oh, Rome, not Rome, Rome has perished. Oh, how could this be? And he's just eaten from my hand." The eunuch then remembered that Honorius was fond of keeping animals, and he had named his favourite chicken Rome. So he clarified that what he meant was that the city of Rome had fallen. Rome, the chicken, was, to the best of his knowledge, doing just fine. And Honorius sighed with relief. Oh, for a minute there, he thought something had happened to his pets. But no, they're fine. It was just the news of his historic capital and the home of Roman civilization being ransacked. Thank heavens for that. If that story is true, and I really hope that it is, it perfectly encapsulates the rule of Honorius. So incompetent as to be almost pitiable. Constantius, on the other hand, was a capable general and a popular administrator. Honorius's flaccid government was only as effective as his chief advisor, and since the death of Stilicho, he had lacked a competent advisor. Constantius stepped forward to fill this role. His importance to the Western Roman Empire in the 410s can be seen from the fact that he was made consul 3 times. Consuls still exist, by the way. You know, just like in the good old days of the Roman Republic. Well, not exactly like in the Roman Republic. These guys aren't elected, they're appointed, usually as a sign of the emperor's favour. The emperor himself also often holds consulships. Honorius held office for the first time when he was 2 years old. Constantius was the man that Placidia was to marry, and according to our sources, she was not at all happy about this. She vocally protested at the wedding itself, which must have soured the mood a little bit. And her brother, being the all-powerful emperor, got around his sister's refusal by physically grabbing her hand and putting it in Constantius's. And that was that. Thus began an awkward and unhappy marriage. Placidia and Constantius would have 2 children, a daughter called Honoria, born in 418, and a son called Valentinian, born in 419. And here we see yet more evidence of Placidia's unhappiness with her husband. It was usual in Roman naming tradition for there to be some indicator of who their father was, but neither of her children are named for Constantius. Her daughter honours her brother, Honorius, by calling her Honoria, and her son's first name is the masculinized version of hers as the mother, as well as a nod to his maternal grandfather, Valentinian I. But there's no tribute to the father, Constantius, in either of their names. You could argue that Valentinian's first name, Flavius, might have been a nod to his dad, who was also called Flavius, but Flavius is a very common first name in late antiquity. You couldn't swing a cat around in Ravenna in the 5th century without hitting a few Flaviuses. If Galla Placidia went to her balcony and called out the name Flavius as loud as she could, she would summon her husband, her son, and about half the men in Ravenna. That's how common this name was. We don't know exactly why Placidia hated her new husband so much. Maybe she still remembered the role that he'd played in jeopardizing her first husband, Ataulf's, attempt to settle southern Gaul. Or perhaps she resented being married off by her brother, like some pawn in his political games. But Olympiodorus of Thebes offers us a simpler explanation. Constantius was ugly. He was a straight-up, unattractive man, twice Placidia's age and below her dignity. He had a wide neck that was the same width as his head. He had bad posture and he went round hunched about. And he had big eyes that gave him this sad, sullen appearance. The Romans were a shallow and insensitive people who thought you could really judge a person by how they looked. They were unlikely to try and look for the inner beauty that Constantius might have had. He was funny, however, and a good laugh at parties, apparently. But to Placidia, this would have likely just reminded her that her husband, unlike her and her brother, was not of imperial stock. He was born to a provincial family of middling wealth, and he stood out as being a bit rustic compared to his wife. In the year 421, Constantius, who was already the de facto ruler of the West, got a promotion to suit his responsibilities. Honorius made him co-emperor alongside him, which was sensible. You know, his marriage to Placidia had made him a part of the imperial family, and Honorius needed a proper grown-up to take care of his empire for him. For Placidia, this was good news. She became an Augusta, an Empress, and got a lot of personal authority out of this. And she also took the opportunity to equip her children with the titles and honours that she too had enjoyed at their age. Nobilissima and Nobilissimus, depending on if they're a boy or girl, which solidified their legitimacy and their position as heirs to the Theodosian dynasty in the West. But the old general himself hated this new position. There were a few reasons for this. To start with, his promotion and his wife's to Augustus and Augusta was recognised in the West, but not in the East. The Eastern court didn't accept this nobody just butting his way into their dynasty and making himself an emperor, and this was a serious indignity for Constantius, and a concerning sign of the growing gap between the Eastern and Western courts. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, Constantius was fun. He liked to party, relax, he liked to have a laugh and a joke with his old army friends. But now those same friends approached him nervously. They came to him on their hands and knees and kissed his shoes and his clothes, and they flattered him, treating him like he was something more than human. To Placidia and Honorius, who were born into the purple, this was normal. Yeah, we're in the imperial family. Of course people kiss your clothes and flatter you and treat you like you're some kind of demigod. But to Constantius, who was not used to this came across as, well, he felt probably the same way that any of us would feel if we were in this position. Like it was uncomfortable and a bit weird. Constantius soon became tired of the throne, since he could no longer come and go when and where he pleased, and his dignity forbade him to indulge in his customary amusements. And thirdly, he was insecure on the throne. His only legitimacy came from his marriage to Placidia, which was insecure and unhappy. We've already seen how the Empress was vocally displeased with her choice of husband and reluctant to credit him as the father of her children, but nothing displays Constantius's powerlessness in this marriage quite like the case of Libanius. Libanius was a man who arrived in Ravenna in 421 from Asia Minor, and he was a magician. The Romans had always believed in and been frightened by sorcery, incantations, curses, and general magical dealings. We even have these cool curse tablets that Romans would use to try and smite their enemies. Magic, or more accurately superstition, was a huge part of the ancient world. I said in a previous video that most ancient people were superstitious to the extent that would make a modern person appear to be mentally ill, and for this reason magic was really genuinely frightening to them, especially in the Christian age, where moral objections to magic morphed into religious ones. Placidia's father had actually drafted legislation against sorcery in 389, and this led to the execution of many practitioners of magic. But Libanius was different. What he offered with his magic was so alluring that even the devoutly Christian emperors Honorius and Constantius felt the need to hear him out, because he offered to solve one of the empire's key problems. As well as the Goths who had sacked Rome, numerous barbarian tribes were rampaging throughout the provinces of the empire. Honorius was scared for his realm, and he had already passed laws forbidding anyone on pain of death from teaching barbarians any skill that might help them spread further, like, for example, shipbuilding or maritime skills. Libanius claimed that he could, through the use of magic, make the barbarians disappear, without any bloodshed, and this was just too good of an offer to pass on, so he was invited by Honorius and Constantius to the court of Ravenna. This sent Placidia into an absolute rage. She was very much her father's daughter, a devout Christian who believed firmly that the empire's fate was tied to its favour from God, and could be jeopardized by upsetting the big man upstairs. This, Placidia thought, was her key responsibility in her role as Augusta, to provide a religious example and to help guide the church and the court in a way that pleased God. Since arriving back in Italy, Placidia had spent most of her time involving herself in the religious controversies of the day. She wrote to bishops, she organised church councils, she got personally involved with the elections of popes in Rome, and now she considered the prevention of sorcery in her court to be her top priority. She told Constantius that unless he executed Libanius immediately, she would divorce him. This was surely no idle threat, and would have been well within her power to do. As we mentioned earlier, there wasn't really much of a religious dynamic to marriage yet, so her strong Christian faith wouldn't have discouraged her from seeking a divorce. Constantius had to oblige, and had the magician killed. This threat of divorce clearly rattled him. All of his legitimacy stemmed from this unhappy marriage with the other emperor's sister. The East still did not recognise him, so if he lost Placidia, well, he could kiss his imperial office goodbye. Which, given how much he hated the role, might not have been such a bad thing if it weren't for one small problem. Emperors don't retire. Well, some of them do. Diocletian did, and so did, I suppose, Priscus Attalus, but emperors like him don't retire. They're either still emperor, or they're dead. If he could have retired, I bet he would have. As I mentioned before, he was clearly miserable in his role as emperor. Luckily for him, though, he didn't have to endure it for very long. In September of 421, only 7 months after being raised to the office, Constantius died. Bit of an abrupt end to the chapter, that, but history's like that sometimes. People just die. Galla Placidia, only in her early 30s, was widowed for the second time. She likely wasn't too torn up about the death of Constantius, at least not right away. But soon, however, I expect she came to miss her old husband, once it became clear that without him, it was just her and her brother Honorius. Shortly after the death of Constantius, the relationship between Honorius and Placidia began to break down. They had never been all that close as siblings, but within a year, Placidia was fearing for her life. What exactly it was that started the feud between brother and sister, and who was responsible for it, isn't exactly clear. Our sources for this are scant and don't really go into too much detail, so we're going to go through events as they happened, and I'll let you guys make up your own mind. As we've previously noted, several barbarian tribes had made their way into the empire and into the provinces of Spain and were wreaking havoc. You had the Swabes up here, the Alans in the middle, and down here in the south, the Vandals. Of these tribes, the Vandals were the serious threat. They were a powerful and warlike people, and they were situated dangerously close to the provinces of North Africa. And boy, it would be a catastrophe if they ever crossed to those provinces. Can you imagine? That would be a disaster. It would really mess the Romans up if the Vandals ever crossed to North Africa. Luckily for the Romans, Honorius had a new commander to replace the late Constantius, a fella named Castinus. The plan was that Castinus would march west, join up with the Goths, who are now allies and federates of Rome, remember, and together they would crush the Vandals in Spain. But according to the Chronicle of Prosper, Castinus was a prideful man who didn't work well with others. Before the expedition had even arrived in Spain, he had a public falling out with his second-in-command, a familiar face to us, Bonifacius. You guys remember Bonifacius, right? I know it's a long video, but he was the guy who wounded Ataulf, Placidia's first husband, on the walls of Massalia by throwing a javelin into his shoulder. Well, that particular episode, along with his other various military exploits, had earned him a reputation as a great, capable soldier and a fine leader. But after arguing with Castinus, Bonifacius took his men and abandoned the expedition. He just went off to North Africa and set himself up as a governor there and started ruling it. He did this without permission, by the way. It's not like he was reassigned or anything. This was a wild and unique move for a Roman general to make. I mean, generals had rebelled before, they had murdered their superiors, they had tried to usurp the throne, but they practically never just opted out of a job and went to go and find a new one somewhere else in the empire. Bonifacius wasn't rebelling, he still recognised Honorius as emperor. He just said that he wouldn't go on the expedition to Spain and appointed himself the Count of Africa. That is genuinely crazy. Castinus went to Spain anyway, confident that he could defeat the Vandals with or without Bonifacius. And the Chronicle tells us that the war started well for the Romans, until treachery sabotaged their efforts. Their Gothic allies abandoned them in the field. When Castinus was forced to return to Italy, having achieved absolutely nothing, he pointed the finger squarely at Placidia as the cause of his defeat. But how could the Empress, sitting in Ravenna, not with the army, have possibly worked against him? It was because Placidia was aligned with both parties who had betrayed the expedition. Despite the fact that about 10 years earlier he had very almost skewered her first husband, Bonifacius had grown close with Placidia. They had become political allies, and it's possible that he only dared to abandon the expedition and set himself up in Africa because he knew Placidia would protect him. And then there's the Goths, the barbarian federates who had left the Romans to die in the field. As a result of her brief tenure as their queen, and the fact that she commanded her own private army of them, Placidia was politically tied to the Goths, and it seems that her brother, and Castinus, considered her to be to some degree or another responsible for them deserting the Roman cause. And that's not necessarily untrue. It's perfectly possible that Placidia was making a play for the empire here. Maybe she befriended a powerful general and mobilised her old Gothic allies with the intention of ousting Castinus and possibly even her own brother as emperor in favour of some other figure, maybe her son, Valentinian. This military failure might have caused drama in the palace, or drama in the palace might have contributed to military failure. Sadly, we just don't know the extent to which Placidia was or wasn't involved in this. But what we do know is that by the year 423, Placidia's Gothic guardsmen and other factions that were aligned with her started clashing violently in the streets with Honorius's soldiers. If Placidia had made a play for power, it had horribly backfired, and she was no longer safe in Ravenna. So she quickly boarded a ship along with her children and escaped east to the court of her nephew. She was going to Constantinople, the great eastern capital, New Rome, the city that sat on two continents, from which Theodosius II, the son of her late brother Arcadius, ruled over these provinces. Approaching this great city would have been exceptionally daunting for Placidia for a few reasons. The first of these was the sight that she beheld when she arrived at the city. The sack of Rome in 410 had really shaken the empire in a way that I haven't really had time to get into in any real depth in this video. Religious men and philosophers wrote theological justifications to it. The Italian aristocracy reacted in many cases by leaving Italy to go somewhere safer, possibly to live as a religious ascetic. And Theodosius II, or more likely his advisors in the East, reacted by making sure that the same thing would never happen to their city. Constantinople had outgrown its old fortifications. When Constantine had founded the city and built its walls, it was only a small centre, but now it was a spreading metropolis. So in the 410s, new walls were built. These Theodosian walls put the defences of other cities to shame. Look at these thick walls. No one's getting through that, not with the technology of the time at least. These walls would withstand the Persians, the Avars, the Arabs, the Rus and the Bulgars, only eventually falling in 1453 when the Ottoman Turks used cannons to blast holes in them. But there were no cannons in the 5th century, so Placidia, approaching the city and seeing these walls, would have considered them the very definition of impregnable. But even more daunting was Placidia's expectation of the reception she'd receive when she arrived. The East had never been kind to her. When she was only an infant, her own brother had barred her entry to the palace. Now that brother's son ruled in the city, and he had shown very few signs of being more sympathetic to her than his father had. He had never recognised her husband Constantius as emperor, and he refused to call her Augusta, the title that she had bestowed on her in the West. So how would he react to her turning up and seeking asylum in his city? Well, that probably wasn't entirely up to him. Theodosius was the emperor, yes, but much of the real power in the palace lay with his sister, Aelia Pulcheria. So, a quick deviation into who Aelia Pulcheria was, partly because it's relevant to Placidia's story, but mostly because she is one of the coolest figures from late antiquity. When Pulcheria was 10 years old and her brother was only 7, their father, Arcadius, the emperor in the East, died. And she watched for 4 years as her little brother was dominated by his advisors. In the West, we've seen how in the absence of a strong guardian or parent, young emperors can be easily manipulated, and in the case of Honorius, this led to disaster. But Honorius didn't have a sister like Pulcheria to sort things out. In the year 412, when she was only 14 years old, Pulcheria took command of the Eastern court. She purged it of her little brother's sycophantic and manipulative officials and began running it her way. To start with, there was the young emperor's education to worry about. So big sister Pulcheria hired all the best tutors and educators from around the empire to come and instruct him on governance, law, and religion. Little Theodosius would never be a soldier emperor like his grandfather. He wouldn't rule from his saddle, sword in hand and breastplate donned, but he would be a wise emperor who governed through sensible and administratively sound policy. This is reflected in his choice of wife, which Pulcheria no doubt had a hand in. Theodosius married the daughter of a prominent Athenian philosopher. His new wife, although from a pagan background, converted to Christianity before the wedding and took the Christian name Aelia Eudokia. This conversion would have been a deal breaker. Both the emperor and his sister were excessively pious. Pulcheria even imposed ascetic values on the Eastern court, discarding the gold, jewellery and purple finery that adorned the emperor of the West in favour of a simpler, more modest garb in the East. Pulcheria's piety led to her taking a vow of lifelong chastity, which she also forced her 2 younger sisters to take, dedicating themselves to God, vowing to never marry or have children. Now this may have been because Pulcheria was genuinely very pious, which she certainly was. Like Placidia in the West, she engaged vigorously with the religious debates and controversies of the time. Her and her brother, the emperor, attended church several times a day and fasted every Wednesday and every Friday. But there may have been another reason for this vow of chastity. As we've seen in the case of Galla Placidia, imperial women, especially single ones, present people with an opportunity. There's no easier way to get into the imperial family than by marrying one of the emperor's female relatives. This is how Constantius had legitimized himself as emperor. It's also how Placidia's father had secured his own legitimacy. He had married the sister of a reigning emperor, Placidia's mother. Aelia Pulcheria had no intention of ever sharing power with anyone except her brother. And she was really, really powerful. There is a case to be made that she is the most powerful woman in Roman history up until this point. She had coins minted in her likeness, and there was a statue of her in the Senate House of Constantinople, right next to the two reigning emperors. So there's a statue of Honorius, a statue of Theodosius, and a statue of Pulcheria, as if she is the third emperor. By taking a vow of lifelong virginity, Pulcheria and her sisters ensured that no man, other than their brother, would ever be a part of the family. Their brother was the only man in the East, the only legitimate emperor, and as long as that was the case, he was safe. And funnily enough, no one seems to have minded. Our sources from the time and from later seem to all agree that Pulcheria was a benevolent ruler and a good influence on her brother the emperor, which is a little odd if you're used to reading any Roman writing about powerful women at all. There's a bit of a trope of Roman authors disliking powerful women and viewing them with suspicion. Yet somehow, Pulcheria avoids this. The authors from the time, who were used to depicting these women as demonic and seductive puppet masters, whose arrogance and inherent feminine weakness lead them to steer the ship of state and any unfortunate cuckolded males that they hold magical power over towards certain disaster. Break from this tradition to turn Pulcheria into a demi-goddess of Christian virtue and statesmanship. So that's who Placidia had to try and impress. There was also the case of Theodosius's wife, Aelia Eudokia, a formidable woman in her own right, but sadly we don't have time to go into her story too. Our story needs to keep moving, because in August of 423, mere weeks after arriving in Constantinople, Placidia received news from the west that her brother, Honorius, the emperor, was dead. So who would rule in Honorius's place? The answer to that question remained very unclear in the weeks following the emperor's death. Well, Placidia had an answer. Her son, Valentinian, was the obvious choice of heir. Bonifacius, the general down in Africa, agreed. He was still vocally supporting the empress and had been sending her money throughout her stay in the Eastern court. But these two alone wouldn't be enough. The rulers of the East, the Emperor Theodosius and his sister Pulcheria, don't seem to have relished this opportunity to make Valentinian their ruling partner in the West. They had never really liked Placidia or her 5-year-old son, and it seems that with his uncle dead, the young Emperor Theodosius now considered himself the sole ruler of the whole Roman Empire. But the situation changed in November of 423. Castinus, the ruling general in the West and Placidia's sworn rival, for some reason or another, raised his own candidate for Western Emperor, without the permission of Constantinople. We've already seen that Theodosius and Pulcheria didn't appreciate the people of the West making new emperors without their consent. Remember how they rejected Placidia's second husband, Constantius? Well, this new emperor, a palace official called Johannes, Johnny Boy, was even worse. He was completely from outside the Theodosian family. He wasn't even married to someone who was, like Constantius was. That made him a usurper, and usurpers cannot be tolerated. The historian Edward Gibbon describes what happened next as the agreement of the 3 females who at that time governed the Roman world. We've already seen that Pulcheria and Eudokia essentially governed the eastern provinces in the name of Theodosius the emperor, who was a bookish and scholarly lad, and with their help, Placidia would rule the West until her son Valentinian came of age. Little Valentinian was raised to the purple and betrothed to his own cousin, Theodosius's infant daughter, Eudoxia. The East finally recognized Placidia's title of Augusta, Empress of the Romans, and with an eastern army she would march west to reassert her family's rule over the whole empire. The command over this invasion would go to a general called Ardabur, or Ardaburius, a man of Alanic origin who had already proven himself fighting the Sassanid Persians in the east, and he had a cunning plan. Ardabur planned to personally take command of the largest section of the Eastern Army, the slow-moving infantry contingent. He would load them onto transport ships and invade across the Adriatic amphibiously, whilst his son would take command of the small but highly mobile cavalry force and attack Italy via the land route. In doing this, he hoped to catch Johannes and Castinus in a pincer movement and crush them. Part of this plan went well. Aspar took his small army and raced to the city of Aquileia. He arrived there so fast that he took the enemy completely by surprise before they could set up fortifications or defences. The city fell completely bloodlessly. So Aspar, his cavalry, Valentinian and Placidia set up shop in Aquileia and awaited news from the south. The other part of Ardabur's plan did not go so smoothly. His fleet was hit by an enormous storm in the Adriatic, and his flagship ended up being separated from the rest of his fleet. The gale blew him right into the waiting arms of the enemy, and the general soon found himself a prisoner of the usurper Johannes. Johannes recognized that if he wanted to rule peacefully for any length of time, he would eventually need to coax a deal out of the east. That meant either winning this civil war or negotiating a favourable peace. And to that end, the general Ardabur was a very valuable hostage, and his value as a hostage might have been undermined if he was in any way ill-treated. So Ardabur was made a free-range prisoner. Yeah, he was technically still a captive, but he was allowed to roam the palace freely. He could talk to whoever he wanted and could basically do as he liked. And he used this freedom to undermine the role of Johannes. Ardabur wandered about the court of Ravenna, reminding people of the cost of treachery and the potential rewards of renewed loyalty. If they were to, abandon Johannes or even aid in his eventual overthrow, I'm sure Constantinople would forget any treasons, and hey, they might even reward this show of fidelity. And when he was satisfied that he had converted enough powerful people to his cause, Ardabur sent a secret message to his son. Attack now. Victory is certain. Aspar took his father's advice. He gathered together a small force and he raced south to Ravenna. Ardabur was right. Victory was guaranteed. Aspar did have to kick a few legionaries around in the marshes outside Ravenna, but he never even had to set up a proper siege. As soon as his army was in sight of the walls, the generals inside the city betrayed Johannes and handed the usurper over in chains. Placidia showed absolutely no mercy when she got her hands on the usurper. She actually organised a full festival, a complete day which involved the public humiliation of Johannes and several tortures. The day started with Johannes having his right hand symbolically cut off. He was then loaded onto the back of a donkey and taken round on a little procession round the city of Aquileia, making occasional stops so that passers-by could kick the shit out of him. After a long day of torture, humiliation and misery, the would-be emperor of the West was beheaded. Placidia had her son Valentinian proclaimed Emperor of Rome. Again, this was the second coronation ceremony, but this was done in Rome itself, which felt more proper. She also had her daughter, Honoria, made an Augusta, just like her, so everyone was happy. The legitimacy of her family was secured, the West was at peace, everyone could relax. For about 5 minutes until Italy was invaded again. Okay, so the war was over, but it wasn't properly over. A new player had entered the game, and pay attention because he's an important one. Flavius Aetius, a prominent member of the Gallo-Roman nobility, had invaded Italy with tens of thousands of Hunnic warriors. Aetius had declared his loyalty to Johannes back when the war started, and he promised to bring to the table thousands of Hunnic allies. We'll talk more about who the Huns were later on in the video, but to be fair, if you know anything about the last decades of the Roman Empire, you already know how scary these guys are. Like Placidia, Aetius had spent much of his young life living amongst the barbarians. He had actually been raised briefly at the court of Alaric and the Goths a few years before the sack of Rome, but he'd spent the bulk of his formative years at the court of the Hunnic king Uldin. And like Placidia with the Goths, he had developed a number of personal connections amongst these people. He could personally command a ton of Huns. But by the time he and his big scary army even arrived in Italy, the war was over. Johannes had been defeated. There was nothing left to do. But Aetius, who had not come all this way for nothing, decided to start pillaging stuff anyway. Aspar rode out to meet him, and the two fought a brief but bloody battle that ended in a stalemate. This convinced everyone to call a truce and go to the negotiating table to see if they could figure out this whole mess and prevent another civil war. Placidia called together her generals and Aetius to divide up the empire between them and decide how it would be governed. Aetius would be reconciled, forgiven for his treason, and allowed to remain a Roman general. But this was a careful balancing act. Placidia had to give these powerful and ambitious men enough to keep them loyal, but not so much that they can gather together enough resources to seize power themselves. To give ambitious men enough power to satisfy them, but not so much that they might become a threat. Like Pulcheria was doing in the east, she wanted to make sure that the young emperor wasn't threatened by powerful men who might influence him or even overthrow him. So in aid of this, she divided the empire into 3 zones of responsibility to be ruled by 3 different men. Anything north of the Alps would fall under Aetius's jurisdiction. This would be his zone. This was a large enough command to satisfy the general's ego, whilst also keeping a nice big mountain range between him and her son. Also, Spain and Gaul were a mess. Barbarian tribes were rampaging through them, and rebel groups were popping up everywhere. Aetius would be kept too busy fighting these rivals to even think of turning his swords on Ravenna. North Africa would remain the domain of Bonifacius, Placidia's trusted ally who had been supporting her politically and financially for years now. Placidia clearly felt that she could trust Bonifacius enough to give him complete control over the empire's most economically important provinces. As I mentioned earlier in the video, North Africa contributed an enormous amount of the West's revenue and an even larger amount of its food supply, so it was good to have an ally there. But neither would get control of Italy. The province in which Placidia herself and her children were residing would not fall under the jurisdiction of either of these powerful and ambitious men. Instead, she chose a third option, a man called Constantius Felix. Felix, unlike Aetius, did not have an independent power base of allies that he might wield against the Empress. Felix, unlike Bonifacius, was not a well-known or popular figure. Felix's wife was Placidia's very close friend who she'd known for years, and it's clear that Placidia thought Felix was the safest option, the least likely to rebel, the least likely to turn against her, the least dangerous, and the most easily controlled and predictable of the 3 generals. If you're wondering what happened to Castinus, by the way, you know, that inveterate rival of Placidia's, the man who had helped drive her and her children from their home, the one who had started this whole civil war by making Johannes, you know, an emperor, well, join the club, because I'm wondering what happened to him too. The only source I could find said that he was exiled, which seems unfair that he gets to live whilst Johannes gets mutilated, tortured and killed, but there you go, I guess. He lives his life in exile. So that is how Placidia survived the civil war. That is how Placidia made herself Empress of the West and Regent for her young son who would one day rule there. and this is how she divided up her empire between her generals, to keep them from fighting each other and to keep them from posing a threat to her son, especially Aetius. You can't trust Aetius, that much is clear. This plan would not work. After years of tumultuous uncertainty, Placidia was finally in a position of relative safety. Over the course of the last decade, she had been made a prisoner of an invading tribe. She had been driven from her home, and she had feared for her own life and the lives of her children. But now, her useless brother, the Emperor Honorius, was dead. The civil wars were over, and she was ruling the Western Empire as regent for her young son. But Placidia's position was still far from secure. Her son was still young and vulnerable. The Western Empire had been weakened by years of incompetent rule and chaos, and she was surrounded by ambitious individuals, all looking for ways to increase their own power and wealth. So how would she deal with these problems? Let's start where we left off in the last chapter, balancing the interests of the Roman generals. These men were vital to the safety of the empire, especially in a time of widespread instability, but they were also dangerous. Thus Placidia's solution of dividing the empire into 3 zones of responsibility. But despite this separation of powers, the balancing of their egos, and the assurances of cooperation, the ambitions and interests of these 3 commanders would cause numerous headaches for Placidia. To start with, Constantius Felix. At first glance, he appears the most predictable, harmless, and reliable of the 3 commanders, but he turned out to be a little bit of a wild card. When he came to power, he started orchestrating the murders of various holy men who had grown popular throughout the empire. Why did he do this? We're not sure. Why was he so awful at covering his tracks after murdering people? Well, that's not certain. Did he really do this, or is it just our sources blaming him unfairly as a result of some unknown grudge or bias? Well, we can't know. But he really shook things up when he started another full-blown civil war with Bonifacius. With or without Placidia's permission, he sailed an army to North Africa and tried to depose his colleague. There are a few reasons why he might have started this war. Bonifacius was extremely powerful and had set himself up as basically the ruler of all the North African provinces. Felix might have recognized that letting such a powerful man continue to reign unchecked was just bad imperial policy. Or maybe it was jealousy of Bonifacius's position. Or perhaps it had something to do with the fact that Bonifacius had recently married a woman who was part of the Arian sect of Christianity, which irritated the Nicaean Christian powers that be. Either way, the war was a disaster for Felix. Bonifacius was a legitimately very talented commander who easily repelled his assaults. Needless to say, this was a catastrophe for both the empire's stability and for the people of North Africa. With all the soldiers fighting each other, there was no one to look out for the locals. This led to Bishop Augustin writing a venomous letter of reproach to Bonifacius. "What shall I say of the devastation of Africa at this hour by hordes of African barbarians, to whom no resistance is offered, while you are engrossed in such embarrassments in your own circumstances, and are taking no measures for averting this calamity? Who would have feared, after Bonifacius became a count of the empire and of Africa, and had been placed in command in Africa with so large an army and so great authority, that the same man who formerly as tribune kept all these barbarous tribes in peace by storming their strongholds and menacing them with his small band of brave confederates, should now have suffered the barbarians to be so bold, to encroach so far, to destroy and plunder so much, and to turn into deserts such vast regions once densely peopled? Where were any found that did not predict that, as soon as you obtained the authority of count, the African hordes would be not only checked, but made tributaries to the Roman Empire? And now, how completely the event has disappointed men's hopes you yourself perceive. In fact, I need say nothing more on the subject, because your own reflection must suggest much more than I can put into words." Eventually, Placidia negotiated an end to hostilities. Both generals were told to just pack it in, and they both got a little handout to take the sting out of this whole thing. Placidia made Felix a patrician. The title patrician, like that of consul, was a historic one in Rome, one that harkened back to its republican roots. But it was even more meaningless than being a consul. Romans in the 5th century had patricians in the same way that we British in the 21st century still have knights. You know, it's not an official position. It doesn't have any of the rights, privileges, or responsibilities that it used to. It's basically just a prestigious title and a show of favour from the establishment. And Bonifacius got to keep his African fiefdom. There are two potential reasons for this. One might be that Placidia really did trust Bonifacius. He had been her ally for years now, and she was happy to keep him in control of this essential region. Or perhaps, as one historian has suggested, she had little choice, and this is a sign of growing warlordism amongst the generals of the Western Army. Back in the day, by which I mean up until this point in Roman history, generals who rebelled against the state often did so by declaring themselves emperor. There are exceptions, like the splinter states of the 3rd century, but generally speaking, a play against the emperor was also a bid to replace him. If we look at it this way, Bonifacius is amongst the first in a troubling trend of Roman generals rebelling against the imperial regime, not with the hope of replacing it, but with the hope of being left alone by it, gently folding away from the centre and speeding up the process of the empire's slow disintegration. Anyways, as soon as things started to look like they were calming down, Aetius got involved. Probably noticing that Felix was on a mission to remove any potential rivals for power, Aetius decided to strike first. Felix and his wife remained personally very close to the Empress Placidia. All they had to do was donate a mosaic to the Lateran Church in Rome, and all that mess that they'd caused in North Africa was quickly forgotten. So Aetius probably acted. Like, we don't know for sure if it was him, but come on, it was probably him. One day, whilst leaving a church in Ravenna, Felix and his wife were assaulted in the streets and killed, along with the church deacon who was accompanying them. This would have no doubt shocked Placidia. Felix was a troublemaker, yes, but he was her troublemaker, and his wife, who was killed alongside him, was one of her oldest and closest friends. It was also a bold play by Aetius, whose involvement in the murder seems to have only been thinly veiled. It seems that Placidia's plan to keep him busy and content with his Gallic command had failed, and she still had reason to fear him. She couldn't just remove Aetius. He was too powerful for that, but for the sake of her own survival, it was prudent that she prevent him from accumulating any more power. So she turned to Bonifacius, her old ally who she still felt she could trust, and she showered him with honours, with powers and with authority, building him up as a powerful rival to Aetius. According to the 6th century writer Procopius, Aetius responded to this by conspiring against both the Empress and the North African general, driving a wedge between them. He sent a letter to Placidia, planting the seeds of suspicion, reminding her that Bonifacius controls all of North Africa, the Western Empire's food supply, and much of its revenue. He's definitely powerful enough to overthrow the Empress and her son. Sure, he's loyal now, while it suits him, but before long he'll realise just how powerful he is, and when he decides to turn that power against you, there'll be little anyone can do to stop him. Aetius then recommended that Placidia summon Bonifacius to court in Ravenna. If he's innocent, he'll obey, he'll come, no trouble, it's just a summons from the Empress, no big deal. But if he's planning something nefarious, you summoning him to court without reason will make him think that you suspect something. If he truly is treasonous, he will find an excuse to not come to Italy. So Placidia sent orders to Bonifacius, commanding him to return to Italy. But she didn't realise that Aetius had also been sending letters to North Africa. Aetius had written to Bonifacius, warning him that Placidia wanted to remove him from power. She's plotting against you, she's fabricated evidence, and she wants to execute you for treason. Beware, Soon the Empress will call you to court for no particular reason. Whatever you do, don't go. That's her trap. Aetius had successfully played the Empress and the Commander-in-Chief and turned them against each other. He had convinced Placidia that Bonifacius was a rebel, and he had convinced Bonifacius that Placidia thought he was a rebel, which encouraged him to, well, rebel. I mean, if you've been found guilty of treason, you might as well become a traitor. Except Aetius didn't count on one thing: that Bonifacius was a popular guy with many good and clever friends in court. They heard all of this go down. They heard about Bonifacius' supposed rebellion, and they heard Aetius warn the Empress that it was coming, and they thought this was odd. They knew their friend. They knew that he wasn't the kind of guy to just rebel against imperial authority, especially not against Placidia, who he had risked everything to support for years now. They got permission from the Empress to sail to Carthage, have a chat with their friend, and see if they could get to the bottom of this whole thing. When they met Bonifacius, he produced the letter that Aetius had sent him, warning him that the Empress was going to have him executed, and they instantly put two and two together. The Gallic general was clearly behind all of this. Now knowing that they had been led on by Aetius, Bonifacius and Placidia made peace, and the general finally sailed to Italy. Aetius, who realised that his scheme had come completely unravelled, decided to do things the old-fashioned way. He gathered up a great big army, and he rebelled against the emperor. Aetius and Bonifacius met in battle outside the Italian city of Arminium, and the clash resulted in the defeat of Aetius's force, and he had to run away with his tail between his legs. Bonifacius stood triumphant, the most powerful general in the empire, loyal ever to the Empress Placidia, and he stood triumphant for only a few days. He had been wounded during the fight, and as often happened in antiquity when they didn't really understand, bacteria and things, relatively minor wounds festered. This one did. It killed him. And thus ended another completely pointless round of bloody civil wars. The death of Bonifacius left Placidia in a weak position. She was forced to reconcile with Aetius, the only surviving commander of her initial three, and irritatingly, her least favourite. Aetius was now the supreme commander of the Western Empire, the Magister Militum, the commander-in-chief, unchallenged and unchallengeable. To his credit, Aetius immediately turned his attention to re-stabilising the empire that he had just contributed so much to making unstable. And, for all of his faults, and Aetius had many faults, he was a capable military leader, and the empire needed one of those. But sadly, no amount of competent leadership could fix the problems that these civil wars had caused. Even with Aetius at the helm, there was no undoing the damage that they had done to the empire. For Galla Placidia, balancing the interests of these rival generals was just one of her many responsibilities. From 425 to 437, she effectively ran the Western court in the name of her infant son, and what she did in that time reveals quite a lot about her priorities. One of her main concerns, for example, was ensuring the continued stability and dominance of her family, the Theodosian dynasty. This is something she seems to have had in common with the rest of her relatives, in both the Eastern and Western courts. No matter the circumstances, no matter the situation in the rest of the empire, the continued security of the Theodosian dynasty was always the top priority. Usurpers were not tolerated, and outsiders were always viewed with a degree of suspicion. One of the key reasons for the growing rift between the Eastern and Western courts that had developed during the reign of Honorius was that emperor's tendency to rely on advisors and co-emperors that came from outside of the dynasty. To this end, Placidia's son Valentinian was betrothed to her great niece, Licinia Eudoxia, thereby binding the Eastern and Western courts closer together and keeping the whole thing in the family. It's a ruling dynasty. Inbreeding is just part and parcel of what they do. Her daughter, Honoria, is a little trickier to figure out. She's not really mentioned much in the sources. Not yet, anyway. But it seems that Placidia never intended to arrange a marriage for her. It's possible that Placidia intended that her daughter, like Pulcheria in the east, would take a vow of religious chastity. We've already seen, and Placidia surely knew, how dangerous imperial women could be. It was easy for men to gain legitimacy for themselves by marrying them. You know, this is what Ataulf had done with her. Her own father had married the sister of an emperor to legitimize his own rule. By keeping Honoria single, it prevented her own son from being threatened by any outsiders making their way into the family. The rest of Placidia's time was taken up with the unglamorous but nevertheless important side of ruling. The boring stuff. Legal disputes and religious controversies. As we saw in her influence on Ataulf and the Goths, Placidia was a believer in the importance of Roman law. Law, she believed, was the foundation of what made Rome great and everything else barbarian. The problem facing the Roman Empire in the 5th century, however, was that the Roman law that they depended on had existed for hundreds of years at this point, and it had been generations since anyone had undertaken the gargantuan task of sorting through, compiling, and trying to make sense of the mess of centuries of laws and precedents all stacked on top of one another. The law was messy and often contradictory, which is problematic in a legal system which relies on being consistent and clear. Placidia sought to get around this in the year 426, when her court passed the Law of Citations, which established a hierarchy of precedents to be used on the all-too-regular occasion that multiple Roman laws clashed with each other. It's hard to tell exactly how much influence Placidia had over these legal proceedings, because in the late Roman Empire, laws were always credited to both emperors, so in this case Valentinian and Theodosius, no matter who they were relevant to or whose idea it was, which makes tracing the origin of the law actually quite difficult. Nevertheless, given that Placidia was acting as regent for her very young son, I think it's reasonable to assume that most of the laws passed in the West during this time were either conceived of by Placidia or at least passed with her consent. But Placidia was always careful to make sure that she was never overshadowing her son. She was regent, yes, but he was still the emperor. When Valentinian was made consul in 426, he presented the Roman Senate with a constitution, a set of declarations setting out the type of emperor that he was going to be. Now, Placidia and her advisors were almost certainly the real masterminds behind this constitution. It's doubtful that the 9-year-old Valentinian was getting to grips with the nuances of imperial rule at this point, but they give us an insight into the type of ruler that Placidia was trying to shape her son into being. Valentinian declared that he would guarantee the traditional rights and privileges of the Senate, which I'm sure they were thrilled to hear. It also has some darker stuff about the rights of slaveholders over their human property, and a little bit at the end about crushing rebellions. There's also a passage about zero tolerance for anyone bringing complaints about innocent people, saying that you can't investigate the innocent, which seems like a weird law. I mean, how do you have a law against investigating innocent people? How do you know if someone's innocent unless you've already investigated? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but I think it's perhaps a sign of the growing frustration Placidia and the Western court had at the absolute mess of Roman law and the troubles it caused them. The messiness of Roman law would eventually be tackled by the Eastern court in a far more comprehensive manner. The scholars working for Theodosius II spent years compiling the Theodosian Code, a huge and extremely dull encyclopedia of Roman law that gives me horrific flashbacks to my dissertation. The Theodosian Code gathered together all of the relevant laws in the Roman legal system, and it sorted through and edited them, discarding any that it considered to be redundant. Interestingly, only 12 laws passed in the West during Placidia's regency made it into the complete codex, which averages out at about 1 law per year of her being in power, which is pretty odd when you consider that the average in the code is 20 laws per year, which suggests that Placidia wasn't all that interested in legislation. But that really doesn't make all that much sense given what we know about Placidia, and even less sense when you consider that 6 of those 12 laws all come from a single year, 428. So what, Placidia was just really lazy for several years, and then suddenly energetically started passing laws for 1 year, only to give up again afterwards? That doesn't seem right. That's probably not what happened. What's more likely is that Theodosius's lawyers simply did not recognise many of the laws that she passed. What's more, in her book about Placidia, which is here, historian Haygath Sivan suggests that Theodosius actually hijacked Placidia's idea. The idea of this theory is that the law of citations in 426 wasn't Placidia just trying to find an easy fix to the nightmare of Roman law. It was actually the cornerstone of a new Roman legal theory that she planned on working on throughout the years. The idea is that her and the Western court even planned their own Valentinian code, but as a result of the troubles that they faced, the problems in the Western Empire, and the various distractions, Placidia never got round to doing this. This led to the Eastern court stealing the idea and taking it even further with the Theodosian code. But what we also see here is how Placidia, Pulcheria, Theodosius, and the whole empire saw itself. We've been talking about the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire, the court in Ravenna and the court in Constantinople, as if they're two separate entities, two separate states. It's as if when Theodosius I died and left the empire to his two sons, the Roman Empire ends, and two new successor empires, the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, rise in its place. But that wasn't so. This was still one empire, one united Roman dominion, governed from two separate courts. And the fact that it was governed from two courts in no way undermined, in the minds of the people living at the time, the idea of a unified Roman Empire. I feel the need to remind you guys about this because, well, in practice, it does seem like they act like two different states. In our story so far, the Eastern and Western court have worked against each other as often as they've worked together. And that's true also. Ravenna and Constantinople had drifted apart in the last few decades, but with the death of Honorius, the end of the civil wars, and the raising of Valentinian as emperor in the West, that rivalry was over, or at least subdued. In the Senate houses of both Rome and Constantinople, there were statues of Valentinian and Theodosius. Laws were passed in both of their names, and armies were regularly transferred between the eastern and western halves of the empire. Any appeal to an emperor would politely address both emperors, regardless of which one was relevant to that particular issue. For example, if I was a Greek winemaker living in Asia Minor, which is very much in the eastern part of the empire, and Euphemius, that bastard from down the road, keeps on riding his horse all over my vineyards, I would complain to both emperors, not just the eastern one. My letter of appeal wouldn't start with, "Dear Theodosius, as the emperor whose responsibility it is to deal with the part of the empire in which I live, I appeal to you singularly to make a law keeping Euphemius and his horses off my land." It would say, "Dear Theodosius and Valentinian," even though Valentinian is a 9-year-old boy who lives 1,000 miles away and has nothing to do with this region, "I would like you both to pass a law keeping Euphemius well away from my land." So despite the fact that there are two halves to the Roman Empire and two courts, it is still one whole Roman Empire. But regardless of this, it was very clear by the 5th century that the eastern half was the more powerful and the more stable of the two, and Theodosius was clearly the senior emperor between him and Valentinian. And this wasn't just because Theodosius was an adult and Valentinian was a child, who was only emperor because of Theodosius's help. Well, it was because of that, but it was also because the West had been suffering far more grievously than the East had been. As we've seen, and as we will continue to see in this video, the Western Empire was beset on all sides by invading barbarian tribes, whilst the East was enjoying a period of prolonged peace with its usual big scary rival, the Sassanid Persians. The East was also where the money was. Like, sure, the West had North Africa and Carthage, good for them. But in the east, you had the great cities of Anatolia, Egypt, and Syria, which sat upon lucrative trade routes. The east made a fortune, whilst the west had to contend with massive borders, funded by the relatively meagre wealth of their smaller and generally newer cities. So despite the sting in pride she might have felt from it, after all, the Easterners had never really respected her, Placidia was forced to get as cozy with them as possible for the security of herself, her son, and her half of the empire. There's a bit of a dearth in sources regarding what else Placidia got up to during her regency. Sadly, most of her actions aren't recorded, but those that are show the other side of her priorities. Like her father was before her, and like the rest of her family, Placidia was a staunch and pious advocate for the Nicene branch of Christianity. She was a prodigious church builder and restorer, constructing and rebuilding shrines from Rome to Jerusalem. In Ravenna, she constructed a large church dedicated to St. John the Evangelist, which she did in thanks for the saint saving her from a shipwreck. A few years ago, when she had fled from Italy, her and her children had been caught in a massive storm on the Adriatic Sea, and it was so bad that Placidia didn't think she'd survive. So she prayed to St. John the Evangelist, promising that if he would save her from this storm, she would dedicate a church to him in Ravenna. And a few years later, she fulfilled this promise. We've also seen another example of Placidia's fierce piety in her opposition to pagan holy men and to magicians. But as well as disdaining these people, she also had a good deal of respect and reverence for those who were considered particularly holy and close to God within the Christian community. At some point during her regency, Placidia was visited by the Gallic holy man Germanus, and the two of them had a chat and exchanged gifts, which seems to have absolutely thrilled Placidia, because she had all of his gifts set into gold and kept as holy relics. Eventually, Germanus fell sick, and he realised that he would die in the city of Ravenna. So Placidia visited him at his sickbed every day and promised to grant him any wish he wanted. And the wish he asked for is that his body be returned to his hometown in Gaul. But Placidia was reluctant to grant this particular wish because, slightly weirdly, she wanted to keep Germanus's body for herself as a souvenir, a relic, and a reminder of their time together. But she respected the holy man so much that she did eventually fulfill this last request of his and had his body sent back to Gaul. I like this little anecdote. It's an all too rare insight into the type of person that Galla Placidia might have been. We hear a lot in our sources about what she did and what happened to her, but very little to add colour to the personality behind the Empress. Here we get a little snippet of that, her deep piety and her religious faith being a matter of deep personal importance. I mention this because a fiery religious controversy erupted during Placidia's regency, when a new bishop of Constantinople was raised by the name of Nestorius. Nestorius was a religious fanatic even by the standards of religious fanatics. One church writer said of him, "He could not rest, but seeking every means of harassing those who did not embrace his own sentiments." I think it's fair to say that if he were alive today, he would have been utterly insufferable on Twitter. And Nestorius clashed with Pulcheria, the empress in the east, over the exact nature of Christ. Here we go again. It's always over the exact nature of Christ. You see, Nestorius thought that Christ was not born a god. Mary did not conceive of God within her womb. Christ was born a pretty normal, albeit very special, human baby, who later in life became one with the Word, or with God. Pulcheria, the empress in the east, disagreed, and this led to a church council being called at the city of Ephesus in 431. And this council decided that Nestorius was wrong, that Mary did indeed give birth to the Christ in his eventual form as both human and God. She was Theotokos, the bearer of God. Nestorius and his followers were excommunicated and pronounced heretics. But this, like all church councils,
failed to actually end the argument. Nestorius and his followers weren't about to stop believing in their deeply held religious faith just because a bunch of other bishops had told them to. But this did have an interesting effect on the Roman Empire and the history of Christianity. So Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, had always been important to Christians. Her worship can be traced back to the 2nd century catacombs. But now her worship was officially sanctioned by the church. There were very few churches, shrines or chapels dedicated to the Virgin Mary. I'm pretty sure there's only the one, and it's like a little one in Syria. Like, she's important, yes, but people don't really pray to Mary in the same way that they pray to other saints like Placidia prayed to St. John the Evangelist. She was a solid side character in the story of Christ. But after the First Council at Ephesus, churches dedicated to Mary, Mother of God, start popping up all over the empire. Pulcheria built 3 of them in Constantinople, and Pope Sixtus in Rome started the construction of the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore, which is still there today. I don't think it's still the same one. I imagine they've renovated it since, but, it's still there. Now, I don't want to overemphasize the importance of this. The story of Mary and her worship is a long one, but this was an important step in her journey towards her later role and centrality in the Catholic Church, and the reason why today you can't walk through the city of Rome without bumping into a church or chapel dedicated to her on pretty much any street. Now, we have no records of what Placidia thought about all of this, but I think it's fair to assume that, like Pulcheria and many in the Eastern Court, she agreed with the conclusion of the Council of Ephesus and condemned Nestorius. Anyways, there's a little bit of an insight into what Placidia was up to during her regency. Probably. We don't know for sure because, like I mentioned earlier, the sources for this particular period are pitifully light on detail. And come the year 437, Placidia's regency came to an end. Valentinian III came of age, married his cousin, and began ruling the empire in his own right. Unfortunately for him, the empire that he inherited was beset on all sides by trouble on its borders. As we've covered, the Western Roman Empire for the last 25 years or so had suffered from the incursions of various migrating and invading tribes from the north and east. We followed the story of the Goths fairly closely, but their story is just that of one tribe of many that entered the empire's borders. 3 other big tribal confederations that had settled within the empire's borders were the Vandals, Suabes, and the Alans. These guys had crossed through Gaul in 407, and by the early 410s had set themselves up in Spain. The church writer Orosius, who was himself from Spain, describes the invasion like this.
Spain has been invaded and has suffered slaughter and devastation, but this is nothing new. During the last 2 years, while the sword of the enemy raged, she endured no harsher treatment from the barbarians than that which she had formerly suffered under the Romans for 200 years, or than that which she experienced when ravaged for almost 12 years by the Germans in the reign of the Emperor Gallienus. Nevertheless, soon afterwards, the barbarians came to detest their swords, betook themselves to the plough, and are affectionately treating the rest of the Romans as comrades and friends, so that now among them there may be found some Romans who, living with the barbarians, prefer freedom with poverty to tribute paying with anxiety amongst their own people.
There isn't much of a sense of decline or collapse in there, is there? I mean, with hindsight, we now know that Spain, like Britain, was now essentially lost to the empire. But at the time, these barbarian invasions seem to have been treated as a mere change in management. The barbarians themselves, like the Goths before them, seem to have had a bit of keenness to integrate somewhat with the Roman Empire that they were invading. And the empire could take these kinds of knocks. Britain and Spain were important provinces, yes, but they weren't essential to the empire's survival in the same way that, say, North Africa was. North Africa was where most of the money, and more importantly, the grain, came from. The empire could deal with the loss in manpower and tax revenue that came from losing Spain, but to lose North Africa, well, that could mean losing the empire.
Anyways, in the year 429, the Vandals invaded North Africa. Why exactly they did this is a little bit up in the air. According to the writer Procopius, they were invited to North Africa by Bonifacius, Placidia's old ally and general in the region. Apparently, for that brief period where he was under the impression, due to Aetius, that Placidia was plotting against him, he had invited 80,000 Vandal warriors into his domains in alliance. When he and Placidia then reconciled, these Vandal allies simply refused to go home. This story is probably not true. If it is, it shows a bizarre naivety on Bonifacius's behalf. What I think is more likely is that the Vandals invaded North Africa in 429 because they could. Rome was weak, and it was only getting weaker with each round of pointless civil wars that it got itself wrapped up in. The Western Emperor was a child, and his mother, the Regent, seemed incapable of keeping even her own commanders in line. A year before the invasion, the old Vandal king had died, and he'd been replaced by the king Genseric, a savvy and ambitious man, exactly the kind of character to see an opportunity like this and take it. When he saw the wealthy and fertile provinces of North Africa so poorly defended, he went for it. The Vandals crossed from Spain and landed in North Africa and began blasting eastwards, mowing through Roman garrisons and eventually laying siege to the important port town of Hippo, which was the home of the venerable Christian writer Augustine. Augustine reacted to the siege by praying and then promptly dying, which proved ineffective in repelling the Vandals. This was such a serious threat that even the Eastern Court, which had gotten fairly used to at this point leaving the West to just deal with its own problems, felt compelled to get involved. So they sent Aspar, the general who had previously helped put Valentinian on the throne during the Civil War, down to North Africa to get rid of these barbarians. And Aspar was not really all that successful in this. He managed to halt Genseric and stop the Vandals from taking all of North Africa, but he failed to send them back to where they came from. But this wasn't necessarily the massive failure that it might appear to be. Barbarian tribes made their way into the empire all the time. They'd been doing that for centuries, and granted there was always some initial violence, but eventually these people were always pacified and integrated, and therefore taxed and recruited. Like with the Goths, sure, there was a threat here, but that threat could easily be turned into an opportunity and an asset. This was standard Roman policy at the time. Aetius was currently in Gaul, fighting numerous barbarian tribes, not with the intention of expelling them, but with the intention of pacifying them, so they might eventually be brought under the imperial wing, at which point their warriors could be recruited into the Western army to replace the many thousands of legionaries that had been lost during the multiple rounds of civil war that the Western Empire had endured over the last 2 decades or so. So, in 435, when the Vandals' momentum had slowed down to a crawl, the Romans took the opportunity to offer them a generous peace. Rome would keep all of the important bits of North Africa, like the city of Carthage and so on, but the Vandals would be permitted to settle in the eastern portion of the provinces. In exchange, they would be granted federate status, the same thing that the Goths had. They would be permitted to remain in Roman territory on the condition that they kept the peace and provided soldiers for the rapidly diminishing Western army. To solidify this, and to perhaps ensure the continued cooperation of the Vandals, the son of the king, a guy called Hunneric, was sent to live in the court of Ravenna. Partly, this was for his father's good behaviour. He was acting as a hostage to ensure that the king didn't step out of line. But also, raising the next king of the Vandals amongst the Romans might help eventually integrate these people into Roman ways. This was common at the time and went both ways. Romans would adopt the sons of barbarian kings and raise them amongst their own families, and vice versa. Aetius is a good example. He was raised amongst the Goths and more famously amongst the Huns. But this didn't work. Genseric either called the Romans bluff or simply didn't care that much about the life of his son, because in 439, after 4 years of peace, he attacked the Romans without warning,
taking the key city of Carthage. This took the Romans completely by surprise. Genseric, the sly fox, had attacked them without even making a formal declaration of war. This allowed him to seize what remained of the North African provinces with very little resistance. Once the mainland was solidly under his control, Genseric took to the sea with a massive fleet of ships and warriors and began attacking the island of Sicily. But he had gone too far and awoken a sleeping tiger. The Western Empire was a mess and wholly unequipped to deal with him, but this was still one united Roman Empire, and Theodosius in the east was growing increasingly concerned as Genseric's warriors grew closer to the Italian mainland. The Emperor of the East withdrew soldiers from his Danube frontier to equip an enormous fleet to sail to the aid of the West. A great armada soon bore down on Sicily. The immense resources and manpower of a still formidable Roman Empire was bearing down on Genseric's fleet of pirates and raiders. Genseric, wisely, withdrew back to mainland North Africa and started seeking a peace with the Romans now that he was no longer confident of winning a war. In 442, a new peace treaty was hashed out, and the Romans, frankly, gave up a lot. All of North Africa, its grain supplies, its rich port cities, and its essential tax revenue was ceded to the Vandals. They were now truly the masters of this region. To ensure future stability, the Emperor Valentinian betrothed his daughter, Eudokia, to the Vandal king's son, Huneric. The daughter of a Roman emperor would marry the son of a Vandal king. There was, however, one small issue. Huneric was already engaged. A few years earlier, Genseric had tried to align himself with the Goths by arranging a betrothal between his son and heir and the daughter of the Gothic king Theodoric I. But Genseric found a workaround to this. He accused the girl of trying to poison him, an accusation that was almost certainly just made up for convenience. He just wanted to break the betrothal and needed an excuse. But, as punishment for her crime, the Gothic princess was mutilated. She had her ears and nose cut off and was sent in bandages back to her father. We're not going to dive into the consequences of this too deeply into this video, but needless to say, the Gothic king Theodoric was not at all happy about his daughter's mutilation at the hands of his would-be ally. This incident would create a generational rivalry between the Goths and the Vandals. This marriage was a huge concession on behalf of the Romans. Even when Placidia had married Atov decades ago at this point, this was met with disapproval by the court in Ravenna. It was a huge blow to imperial prestige and Valentinian's pride for him to have to marry his own daughter off to the son of some barbarian warlord, and it was a dangerous one as well. We've already established that marrying female members of the imperial family was one of the key ways that usurpers wiggled their way into power. Valentinian was no longer the only male in the Western Empire that's part of the Theodosian dynasty, and that was inherently destabilizing. But the Romans don't seem to have had much choice. Peace with the Vandals was preferable to war with the Vandals, because a war with the Vandals is a war they could very easily lose. That huge fleet that Theodosius had sent west, that mighty armada that terrified Genseric and sent him scurrying back to North Africa with his tail between his legs, well, that fleet had been recalled by Theodosius. A new threat was brewing in the north, one that overshadowed both the Vandals and the Goths. The Huns were threatening invasion. If you are at all familiar with the story of Rome's fall, you already know who the Huns are. The terrifying Central Asian people who burst onto the scene in the 4th century and bore down on the empire like a horrific force of nature. One of our earliest descriptions of the Huns comes from the 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus. He describes them like so.
Exceed every degree of savagery, since there the cheeks of the children are deeply furrowed with steel, from their very birth, in order that the growth of hair, when it appears at the proper time, may be checked by the wrinkled scars. They grow old without beards and without any beauty, like eunuchs. They all have compact, strong limbs and thick necks, and are so monstrously ugly and misshapen that one might take them for two-legged beasts. But although they have the form of men, however ugly, they are so hardy in their mode of life that they have no need of fire, nor of savoury food, but eat the roots of wild plants and the half-raw flesh of any kind of animal, which they put between their thighs and the backs of their horses, and thus warm a little. They are never protected by any buildings, but avoid these like tombs, which are set apart from everyday use. For not even a hut thatched with reed can be found among them, but roaming at large amid the mountains and woods, they learn from the cradle to endure cold, hunger, and thirst. When away from their homes, they never enter a house unless compelled by extreme necessity, for they think that they are not safe when staying under a roof. They dress in linen cloth or in the skins of field mice sewn together, and they wear the same clothing indoors and out. But when they have once put their necks into a faded tunic, it is not taken off or changed until by long wear and tear it has been reduced to rags and fallen from them bit by bit. From their horses, by night or day, every one of that nation buys and sells, eats and drinks, and bowed over the narrow neck of the animal, relaxes into a sleep so deep as to be accompanied by many dreams. And when deliberation is called for weighty matters, they all consult as a common body in that fashion. They are subject to no royal restraint, but they are content with the disorderly government of their important men, and led by them they force their way through every obstacle. They also sometimes fight when provoked, and then they enter the battle, drawn up in wedge-shaped masses, while their medley of voices makes a savage noise, and they are lightly equipped for swift motion, and unexpected in action. They purposely divide suddenly into scattered bands and attack, rushing about in disorder here and there, dealing terrific slaughter. And because of their extraordinary rapidity of movement, they are never seen to attack a rampart or pillage an enemy's camp. On this account, you would not hesitate to call them the most terrible of all warriors, because they fight from a distance with missiles having sharp bone instead of their usual points, joined to the shafts with wonderful skill. Then they gallop over the intervening spaces and fight hand-to-hand with swords, regardless of their own lives, and while the enemy are guarding against wounds from the sabre thrusts, they throw strips of cloth plaited into nooses over their opponents, and so entangle them that they fetter their limbs and take from them the power of riding or walking. No one in their country ever ploughs a field or touches a plough handle. They are without fixed abode, without hearth, without law or settled mode of life, and keep roaming from place to place like fugitives, accompanied by the wagons in which they live. In wagons their wives weave for them their hideous garments. In wagons they cohabit with their husbands, bear children, and rear them to the age of puberty. None of their offspring, when asked, can tell you where he comes from, since he was conceived in one place, born far from there, and brought up still farther away.
The Huns were Central Asian nomads, who, like many before and many would after, decided to move west, and brought destruction down on those they encountered. Many of the barbarian tribes now in the empire had begun their journey west because they were fleeing the Huns. The Goths are an obvious example. The long series of events that led to the sack of Rome in 410, and them eventually establishing themselves as federates in southern Gaul, began decades earlier, with them arriving on the borders of the empire as refugees, fleeing the Huns. The description of Ammianus Marcellinus comes from a time when the Huns were an entirely new threat to the empire, a people that not many had encountered before. To him, they seemed barely human, because they were essentially an entirely alien culture. By the time of Galla Placidia, however, the Huns had been around long enough that the Romans were a little bit more used to them. Members of the Roman nobility, like Aetius, had grown up amongst the Huns. They knew Huns, they spoke the Hunnic language, and they commanded soldiers of Hunnic origin. In the 440s, a man named Priscus travelled to the court of the Huns and was surprised to find a Greek man living there. This Greek amongst the Huns claimed that he preferred living with the just and honest nomads compared to the corruption and tyranny of living within the empire. The point is, in the early 5th century, the Huns had been around for a little while and the Romans were used to dealing with them. But in the 440s, a new Hunnic king rose who revived their reputation as terrifying beasts from the unknown corners of the world. Attila the Hun had arrived on the historical scene. We've all heard of Attila the Hun, right? The scourge of God, the ferocious warrior who sits in a comfortable second place behind Genghis Khan when most people picture a destructive Central Asian warlord. And it's a well-earned reputation. Soon after becoming king, Attila set about reminding everyone why they should be scared of the Huns. In 447, he began ravaging the Balkan provinces. His justifications for such are as follows. Firstly, the Romans owed him money. The Eastern Empire paid the Huns a yearly tribute to just stay away, and apparently payments had been coming up short. And secondly, the Romans had apparently been giving refuge to Hunnic deserters, likely traitors who didn't accept Attila as their king. But honestly, like Genseric before him, Attila likely attacked the empire because he could. The borders were weakened because so many troops had been pulled from them to fight the Vandals in North Africa. The Balkan provinces were just right there, wealthy and undefended, just sitting there across the Danube. You know, he'd be foolish not to. And so Attila swept south into the Eastern Empire, and as if things weren't bad enough, further disaster struck. Constantinople was kept safe by the mighty Theodosian walls, massive fortifications that would confound armies for centuries to come. But as Attila's army drew closer and closer, an earthquake struck the city, and a portion of the walls crumbled. In a panic, Theodosius and Pulcheria mobilized the city to restore its defenses. They made use of the chariot racing teams, the Blues and the Greens. Appealing to their competitiveness, they were made to, well, compete over who could rebuild their section of the wall the fastest. And thankfully for Theodosius, the repairs were made in time. Attila approached the city, but he never bothered laying siege to it. Instead, he accepted a Roman offer to increase the yearly tribute that the Romans paid the Huns if he would just go back to his side of the border. The Huns were satiated, and Placidia and her children could sleep soundly at night, knowing that Attila was on his side of the Rhine. For now. Okay, so do you guys remember Placidia's daughter Honoria? You know, the sister of Valentinian the Emperor. Fair play if you don't. I've only mentioned her once or twice. She hasn't really played a major role in the story so far. The only notable thing about her is that she's unmarried. No one ever bothered arranging a marriage for her, probably intentionally, so that any husband that she ended up with wouldn't pose a threat to her brother. Well, in 447, Honoria was approaching her 30th birthday, and wasn't as keen on the idea of a vow of chastity as her counterparts in the East were. She was caught having an affair with Eugenius, a court official. When news of this got out, scandal ensued. Valentinian was furious, and Placidia, who was very keen to emulate the Eastern court's image of a pious, chaste court filled with virtuous women, can't have been too pleased with this either. Eugenius was executed. Obviously, you know, you can't just have guys like that wandering around the empire boasting about having slept with the emperor's sister. But Honoria herself was trickier. The easiest solution was to just marry her off. So Placidia and Valentinian found Honoria a nice old Roman senator, a man of suitable rank and position that it wasn't below her dignity to marry him, but also someone who was sufficiently loyal or sufficiently docile enough that he didn't pose a threat to the emperor. But Honoria herself wasn't having any of this. Perhaps inspired by the story of her mother, who had been spirited away at a young age from Rome by a barbarian king, married him and become a queen, she penned a letter. She sent a request for aid to Attila the Hun, begging him to come and save her from this arranged marriage that she wants no part of. And she enclosed in the letter her ring, which Attila read as not only a request to save her from this marriage she doesn't want, but also a proposal saying that she wants to marry him. And to the polygamous king of the Huns, adding the sister of a Roman emperor to his already sizable contingent of wives was frankly too good an offer to refuse. Valentinian captured the eunuch who had sent the message, and after a lengthy torture session, he learned about the whole conspiracy, and he was terrified and furious. Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, who commanded tens of thousands of mounted death machines, was coming to his part of the empire. He didn't have the soldiers or resources to stop him. What was he going to do? Well, to the Emperor Theodosius in the east, the solution was obvious. Just give Attila Honoria. You know, like, that'll do it. That's what he's asked for. This had always been Theodosius's policy with the Huns. Just give them whatever they ask for and hope they stay away. Not a particularly valiant strategy, fair enough, but it worked. Attila was staying out of the east. But Placidia had another idea. An idea that doesn't seem to have been motivated by the good of the empire or by the politics of the Theodosian dynasty, but by a mother's love for her daughter. She asked Valentinian to grant her protection over Honoria. Honoria would be hers to deal with, and her responsibility. And Valentinian, however reluctantly, granted his mother this wish. Honoria was therefore safe under her mother's protection, at least for now. We don't know what happened to her. This whole episode comes from an account written by John of Antioch, who ends by saying that Honoria was free from danger at this time, which is fairly ominous. To say that someone is free from danger at this time is like saying that someone is safe for now. The implication is that safety isn't necessarily guaranteed in the future. So we don't know what happened to the Emperor's sister. After this one event that defines her life, after this one mark she made on history, she disappears into complete historical obscurity. I hope that things worked out for her in some degree or another, but I get the feeling that they didn't. Instead, Attila invaded the Western Empire, bringing his army into Gaul and beginning a campaign of loot and plunder. He had with him in his army not only his Huns, but also his many subject peoples. Burgundians, Gepids and Goths marched with Attila. Not the same Goths that we've been dealing with. These are Goths that stayed outside the Roman Empire and instead were subjugated by the Huns. His vast army was 500,000 strong. Hang on, wait a minute. Well, the primary source says 500,000, but that seems a little bit too much. But still, you get the idea. Loads of them. Against such numbers, what could the Romans possibly do? Well, to start with, they looked around for allies, and they turned to none other than the Goths. The relationship between the Romans and the Goths had been a little bit shaky due to the whole mutilation of a Gothic princess so that she can be replaced by a Roman one thing that had happened a few years ago. But Valentinian sent an embassy to King Theodoric I of the Goths to try and win them back to the Roman side. The Roman ambassador addressed the Goths, saying,
"Bravest of nations, it is the part of prudence for us to unite against the Lord of the earth, who wishes to enslave the whole world, who requires no just cause for battle, but supposes whatever he does is right. He measures his ambition by his might. License satisfies his pride. Despising law and right, he shows himself an enemy to nature herself. And thus he, who clearly is the common foe of each, deserves the hatred of all. Pray remember what you surely cannot forget, that the Huns do not overthrow nations by means of war, where there is an equal chance, but assail them by treachery, which is a greater cause for anxiety. To say nothing about ourselves, can you suffer such insolence to go unpunished? Since you are mighty in arms, give heed to your own danger, and join hands with us in common. Bear aid also to the empire, of which you hold a part. If you will learn how needful such an alliance is for us, look into the plans of the foe."
And Theodoric replied,
"Romans, you have attained your desire. You have made Attila our foe also. We will pursue him wherever he summons us, and though he is puffed up by his victories over diverse races, yet the Goths know how to fight this haughty foe. I call no war dangerous, save one whose cause is weak, for he fears no ill on whom majesty has smiled."
And so the Goths joined the Roman army that was being led by Aetius in Gaul, and together they marched to meet Attila at the Catalaunian fields. The Gothic writer Jordanes gives an epic description of the battle. It has all of the good ancient battle stuff. You know, speeches, massive cavalry charges, things like that. But two individuals really stand out. First of these standout characters is Aetius. Aetius has been a little bit of a villain in our stories so far. You know, devious Aetius, power-hungry Aetius, the guy who seemed to be working against the Empire as often as he worked for it. But here at this battle, he showed history why he deserves his reputation as one of the last truly great Roman generals, one of the only commanders in the Empire who could stand up to Attila the Hun. And the other guy to come off very well in this description is Theodoric, the King of the Goths. Fun little fact for you. Theodoric, King of the Goths, inspired J.R.R. Tolkien's depiction of Theoden in Lord of the Rings, and this battle at the Catalonian Fields against Attila the Hun inspired his depiction of the Battle of Pelennor Fields in Return of the King. The two of them even basically have the same name, you know, Theodoric and Theoden. Theodoric led his Goths from the front in a massive charge against the Hunnic left flank, driving the enemy back and turning the tide of the battle. But unfortunately, like his fantasy counterpart, Theodoric was killed during this cavalry charge, and the Gothic writer Jordanes describes what happened next.
The Visigoths sought their king, and the king's sons their father, wondering at his absence when success had been attained. When, after a long search, they found him where the dead lay thickest, as happens with brave men, they honoured him with songs and bore him away in the sight of the enemy. You might have seen bands of Goths shouting with dissonant cries and paying the honours of death while the battle still raged. Tears were shed, but such as they were accustomed to devote to brave men. It was death indeed, but the Huns are witness that it was a glorious one. It was a death whereby one might well suppose the pride of the enemy would be lowered when they beheld the body of so great a king borne forth with fitting honours. And so the Goths, still continuing rites due to Theodoric, bore forth the royal majesty with sounding arms, and valiant Thorismund, as befitted a son, honoured the glorious spirit of his dear father by following his remains.
It was at this battle that Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, was finally beaten. The Hunnic king was so dejected by his first taste of defeat that whilst retreating he was caught building his own funeral pyre, threatening to throw himself on it. You almost feel sorry for the poor little Hun at this point. His defeat at the Catalonian Fields clearly had an adverse effect on his mental health. But it's important to remember, if you ever find yourself feeling a bit down in the dumps, as we all do sometimes, that even ferocious Central Asian warlords get a bit sad. And so ended Attila's invasion of Gaul. He would have another crack at the Roman Empire before his death, invading Italy in 452, but that's outside the scope of this video. We need to return to Galla Placidia in the last years of her life. Whilst Aetius in Gaul was concerning himself with turning back the Hunnic threat, Galla Placidia in Italy was wrapped up in the fallout of yet another religious controversy. In 449, Placidia was awoken to the news that the Pope had come to court and wanted to speak to her. When she saw the pontiff, he broke down into tears and threw himself at her feet, begging for her help. In Constantinople, yet another vicious argument had broken out between church leaders regarding the nature of Christ. One side of the argument said that Christ had two natures, one human and one divine. And the other side of the argument said that Christ had two natures, one human and one divine. But of these two natures, the divine was more powerful and it overrode the human nature, meaning that he's actually of one nature. But it's two natures combined into one nature. This led to the Emperor Theodosius calling a second council at Ephesus, and it went just terribly. We've already established that church councils do a fairly poor job of mending schisms and reuniting the church. This is people's deeply held faith we're talking about. Being told to just stop it by an authority figure isn't enough to get them to change their beliefs. But the Second Council of Ephesus, sometimes called the Robbers' Council, was the most inflammatory one yet. It was called so quickly that most of the religious leaders and thinkers from around the empire never even got an invite. The small clique of Eastern theologians who actually managed to attend the council spent the whole time basically confirming that their version of Christ, the one that has one nature, that's actually two natures, but two natures combined into one to make one nature, was the only correct version of Christ. and then they spent the rest of the time there getting really, really nice and angry about the fact that not everyone agreed with them. The Pope, along with many other bishops and priests from around the empire who hadn't been in attendance, was furious that a major church council had been held without him, and even angrier that they had pronounced something that he considered a heresy. Much of the east, and pretty much the whole west of the empire, appealed to Theodosius, asking him to reconsider the council's verdict. But Theodosius stood firm by the Robbers' Council results. In another time, Aelia Pulcheria might have stepped in and done something. After all, she disapproved massively of this Robbers' Council. But in 449, the relationship between herself and her brother had really deteriorated, and she was living outside of the palace, no longer talking to or in any way influencing Theodosius. If there is a god, he made his opinion known the following year. The Emperor Theodosius, still stubbornly insisting that the Council of Ephesus had ruled correctly, fell from his horse and cracked his spine. It took 2 days for the emperor to die. He was 49 years old and had ruled the empire for between 42 and 48 years, depending on how you measure these things, which makes him potentially the longest reigning Roman emperor in history, his only competitor for that title being the very first emperor, Augustus, who may have ruled for a year or two less or a year or two more, again depending on how you measure their reigns. The death of her brother led to Aelia Pulcheria making a comeback. She returned to court in Constantinople, took the reins of power, and purged the palace of Theodosius's more troublesome advisors. Now, we've been dealing with a lot of very powerful women in this video so far. Pulcheria is probably the most powerful of them all, a real queen of queens. And yeah, the 5th century is full of really formidable Roman women. Placidia and Pulcheria are probably the most powerful women in Roman history up until this point, if you measure that in influence and political power. But we're still dealing with the Romans here, a patriarchal culture full of unrepentant misogynists who were happy to let pious and chaste women influence their husbands, fathers, sons, brothers, etc., but weren't yet reconciled to the idea of a woman ruling in her own right. We're going to get some female rulers later on in Byzantine history, but that's still a few centuries off. So for now, Pulcheria would need a man to take the official position of emperor and be a figurehead while she did all of her ruling. Pulcheria went with a man named Marcian, a dependable general who she could rely on to deal with the military affairs of the Eastern Empire, whilst she sorted out the court and dealt with the theological mess that her brother had left for her. This deal was made permanent in November of 450, when Pulcheria and Marcian got married. This marriage didn't affect her vow of virginity, by the way. It was a chaste marriage, and really just a formality to make sure that Marcian would be accepted as a legitimate emperor. There was also no pressure to produce an heir, because Pulcheria was already nearing 50 years old and was unlikely to give the house of Theodosius any new members. This was the downside of Pulcheria's strategy of taking a vow of chastity. Sure, it kept her brother safe whilst he was alive, but it also ensured that when he died, it would mean the extinction of the Theodosian line in the east. Anyways, Aelia Pulcheria called a new council in 451 at the city of Chalcedon, which basically undid all of the work of the Robbers' Council, proclaiming that Christ had 2 natures, one human and one divine. Although this calmed the Pope down, it did nothing to mend the schism. 2 church councils, both of which were perfectly legitimate and endorsed by an emperor, had ruled 2 opposite things, both irreconcilable with each other. Those who stuck to the results of the first council in 449, the one that decreed that Christ had but one nature, became Monophysites, whilst those that adhered to the results of the Council of Chalcedon, which in 451, which decreed that Christ had 2 natures, they became Chalcedonians. Monophysitism would become the basis of the Syriac, Indian, Armenian, Coptic and Ethiopian churches, sometimes referred to as Eastern Christianity or Oriental Christianity, whilst the Chalcedonians would evolve into the later Orthodox and Catholic churches. This is all very interesting, I'm sure, but Galla Placidia wouldn't live to see it resolved. She also wouldn't live long enough to see the Huns expelled from her empire. Our Empress, who we've been following for about 60 years now, probably knew she was dying in her final weeks. Being in her early 60s, she had already outlived most of her family. Now, don't get me wrong, plenty of people in the ancient world lived to a ripe old age. You know, the 70s, 80s, it really wasn't that unusual. But the Theodosian family had a particular history of poor health. Her father had died suddenly at the age of 48, and her two brothers had died at the ages of 31 and 38, respectively. One of her final acts was to send word to Barcelona, the city that she had called home over 35 years previously. This gave an order that her first son, little Theodosius, the Gothic prince who had died in the cradle, be exhumed and brought to her in Rome. Shortly after his arrival, in November of 450, Galla Placidia died. She was buried in the mausoleum of her family, right next to her brother. In the mid-8th century, this mausoleum was converted into a chapel dedicated to Saint Petronilla. And a little bit later, a marble sarcophagus was opened, revealing the remains of two individuals, one an adult woman and the other a very, very small child. If these were indeed the remains of Placidia, it's possible that her last wish was to be buried alongside her firstborn son. Okay, so that was the life of Galla Placidia. Long video, right? Fair play if you've made it this far in one go. But what happened to the rest of our cast of characters?
Attila the Hun, the Scourge of God, died in 453. His death left a power vacuum amongst the Huns, who fell into infighting. The existential Hunnic threat to the empire was over. For his role in defeating Attila, Aetius was hailed as a hero by Rome and by the emperor. Only joking, Valentinian murdered him. And I don't mean he paid someone to kill him or had him executed. Valentinian III, the Emperor of Rome, drew his sword and slew Aetius in public. Valentinian considered this a good idea. One of his advisors disagreed, telling the emperor that he had cut off his right hand with his left. He was proven right. Within a year of the general's assassination, two of his loyal soldiers murdered the emperor. Placidia's son was 35 years old and had ruled the empire in his own right for 18 years. With his death, the Theodosian dynasty that Placidia and her family had worked so hard to keep safe and in power finally died out. His replacement, Petronius Maximus, immediately screwed things up further. He cancelled the betrothal of Valentinian's daughter to the son of the Vandal king Genseric. Genseric responded by attacking Rome. The people of the city, running riot in a panic, stoned their new emperor to death. This did nothing to placate Genseric. He sacked Rome. Hard. Much harder than the Goths had 45 years previously. This 2-week-long pillaging session forever associated his people, the Vandals, with damage and destruction. Genseric would outlive the Western Empire that he helped destroy, dying in 477 at the age of 87. The Vandals would remain a power in North Africa and the islands of the Mediterranean for another 60 years, until eventually being reconquered by Constantinople during the reign of the Emperor Justinian. The death of Valentinian also marked the end of anything resembling stability in the Western Empire. No emperor that followed him would ever manage to create a lasting dynasty, or push back the tide of barbarian invasions. The trend of provinces falling away from the centre that had begun with Britain and Spain continued as Gaul and Africa slipped out of imperial grasp. Over the next 2 decades, the emperors of the West exercised less and less control over their empire until they commanded little outside of Italy and Dalmatia. The last of these emperors, a child called Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by one of his generals in 476. The last emperor to rule Rome was, funnily enough, named for both Rome's mythical founder and first emperor. His robes of office were sent to Constantinople, and the now sole ruler of the empire, the Emperor Zeno. The people of the West would continue to pay lip service to him as emperor, even though his influence over them was limited.
And that is how the Roman Empire fell. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. The empire in the east, now often called the Byzantine Empire, although they never stopped calling themselves Romans, would last for another 1,000 years, until finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. When Galla Placidia was born, it was into a Roman Empire that was as strong as it ever was. By the time she died, that empire had declined to the point that all that was left was for it to finally fizzle out. Placidia herself never showed any signs of seeing this coming. And why would she? I mean, nobody else did. Even when the empire did fall, no one at the time really noticed it. It's only with hindsight that we can say that this really was the end. People didn't just wake up one day and go, "Oh my god, the empire's fallen. I'm not Roman anymore." Even if their new landlord was a Vandal king instead of a Roman governor, the new kingdoms that rose in place of the Western Empire, although they were often governed by barbarians from outside it, usually tried to emulate the Roman way of doing things. They learned Latin, they converted to Christianity eventually, and they tried to do things the Roman way even if they adapted that to suit the changing times. When we talk about the end of the Western Roman Empire, it's not a fire and brimstone end. It's not an apocalypse. It's not a bloody last stand, sword in hand of the Roman people against the encroaching Dark Age. It's merely a change in political continuity. For the best part of 500 years, Western Europe and North Africa had been ruled by emperors from Italy. The fall of the Western Empire just means the end of those emperors. At the beginning of this video, I compared Galla Placidia to Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria. Both of them lived through the decline and fall of the state that they had been born into, and both of them failed to prevent that fall or bring back the old days, despite all their wealth, power, and influence. But Ruprecht at least knew what was happening. He knew in his final years that the Kingdom of Bavaria and the German Empire that replaced it were gone. The world that he left behind when he died was unrecognisable to the one that he had been born into. This was not true of Placidia. Placidia likely reckoned that she left the empire stronger than how she'd found it. She had raised a son as emperor, and sure, he was no Augustus, but he was certainly more effective than either of her brothers had been. She'd helped resolve religious controversies, and she'd kept her family in power and outsiders out. But she could not save the empire. I don't really reckon that's her fault. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who could have. But I didn't choose to make a video about her because she was a titan of a historical figure, because she was one of those people who took the reins of history and forever shaped it. No, she wasn't that. I made a video about her because she was one of the last great figures that the Western Empire produced, and through her eyes and through her life, we could witness the decline of that empire and its eventual collapse. And what a wild life she led. I mean, she was born the daughter of an emperor. She was kidnapped by a barbarian tribe when she was a young woman, only to marry that tribe's king and help rule them. Then she was driven from her home, only to return at the head of an army and seize power, ruling an empire on her son's behalf for 12 years. In that time she saw civil wars and losses of territory, political infighting and murders and religious schisms, all of which would contribute to the disintegration of that empire after her death. Thank you all so much for watching, especially the new subscribers, the ones that joined me in the last few weeks, and you know, the old ones who have been around for a few years now. It was a long video, so again, fair play if you made it all the way to the end. And thank you to the patrons, whose names should be scrolling along the side of the screen now. If you want to join the Patreon and get access to videos a little bit earlier than everyone else, along with extra bits, like I post the scripts to the videos there and things, feel free to join. There's a link down below. Thanks again.